English translation 704th Contact. Part 1 Thursday, the 1st of March 2018, 21:54 hours.
Here I am, dear friend. Welcome and greetings too.
Thanks, but I also greet you, Edward, my dear friend.
Then I want to ask you if you can also spare some time today for some questions that are on the tip of my tongue, and that I would like answered.
There is no hurry on my part.
Thanks. Then the question. In the meantime, have you found anything in your daughter Sim-Ya-Sei's records regarding the conversation with Ernst Stuhlinger, the German-American atomic, electrical, and rocket scientist?
No.
Too bad, but that's not the end of the world.
Do you remember exactly what happened then? For my part, I know nothing about such a conversation having taken place between you, my daughter Sim-Ya-Sei, and Stuhlinger. But I feel the need to clarify the matter, so I will ask Sim-Ya-Sei at the next opportunity, which will probably be in a week's time. But I can only give you an answer next month, because until then, I will be absent because I will be with the Sonern, as will Florena, Enjana, Kolkos, and some others. But it may be that someone will still come to see you, depending.
Aha, I will see then. But I have to say that I can remember Ernst Stuhlinger, but I'm not sure when the conversation with him took place. When I had a serious health breakdown at the beginning of the 1980s and fell victim to a severe partial amnesia, it was necessary for me to make an unavoidable effort to work through all the knowledge about my mission again, which took about 10 years, roughly speaking, during which I also had to do the missionary work. In the process, it was impossible for me to also take care of my memory regarding the time of my life that I had lived through, which is why everything related to this remained lost for me in terms of memory from then on, and I have also not been able to work it up again to this day. Therefore, today it is the case that I can hardly remember, or only remember badly or not at all, many experiences, events, situations, and occurrences in my past. My memory only really resumed when I had comprehensively reprocessed all the necessary information about my mission. That is to say, from about 1990 onwards. Everything, or at least 90% or more of my memories of my earlier years and of what happened before my health breakdown, has simply disappeared from my memory. Only sometimes, when I'm struck by certain things, do I remember something again. The whole thing about my not being able to remember is not based on a weakness of memory or a loss of memory power, but on the amnesia I suffered at the beginning of the 1980s, which I was not able to come to terms with, and consequently not able to get my memory back, as you explained to me. And that today I could revisit the lost memory. For that I think I no longer find the time, because since then, when I had the breakdown, my missionary work has increased to such an extent until today that I now have to devote myself intensively to this obligation. Consequently, it is no longer possible for me to revisit my old memories for that reason as well.
To this end, I think you are coping well with the absence of large parts of your life memories, which, according to my earlier analyses, is indeed due to your amnesia as a result of your health breakdown at the beginning of the 1980s, but not to a decline in your memory power, which is still circumferentially strong.
Your observation is comforting, but to talk about it further, well, my next questions and your answers to them should be segregated and not mentioned later when published in Contact Conversation Volume Number 16 because they are core group internal in nature, and consequently the whole thing relates to the core group election next autumn. Consequently, I think these things therefore do not belong in the official discussion report when it is then listed in Volume 16.
Yes, it should be kept that way because internal core group matters do not belong in the public domain under any circumstances. 2 pages from the 704th report have been removed because it concerns purely internal group matters.
You have gone to a lot of trouble there, my friend. But thanks, Ta, and that should clear up everything that needs to be done. Then I have some more questions, like this. Are you familiar with the name Peter Kaufmann, who is said to have been involved in some kind of esoteric activities and also with extraterrestrials? He is said to have lived about 100 to 150 years ago.
No, I am not aware of anything about that. And if this man had been involved with extraterrestrials, by which I assume you are thinking of contacts, then we would know that with absolute certainty.
Sure. Then once again a question regarding radio radiation. Because the other day I heard that Switzerland is so overloaded with mobile phone systems and mobile phone antennas that their energies will no longer be sufficient for the mobile phone devices that are expected to proliferate, which will inevitably and unavoidably result in the future from the ever-increasing population or overpopulation. Irresponsibly. Suggestions are already circulating that the energy capacity of both old and new mobile phone antennas should be increased in order to cover the additional energy demand that will arise in this regard. However, no thought is given to the dangerous energy radiation, because it is still claimed that this is harmless to human beings, exactly the opposite of what you have already explained and warned about several times.
The irresponsible project planning that is already planned in this regard is already underway and cannot be stopped by reasonable objections, explanations, and warnings, because fundamentally those responsible for this are not concerned with good communication of the population nationwide, but solely with horrendous financial profits and profiteering. By switching on more powerful transmitting energies, they become more and more dangerous to the health of human beings, not only for the users of mobile phones, but also for all those who do not use such devices. All human beings who live or work in the vicinity of such transmitters will be particularly at risk, because the radiation from such transmitters can damage their health in various ways. Cancer diseases are just as much in the foreground as miscarriages and disorders of consciousness and nerves, headaches and concentration disorders, etc., etc. But such physical impairments also have an effect on the psyche, so that these radiations also cause psychological disorders and even irreparable damage, which has to be treated by psychiatry for a long time, which is hardly successful and may even lead to suicide. But all this is not only related to Earth humans, for mammals and all other animals, etc., will also be affected in the same or a similar way and will have to suffer. Although this is not all, for not only the fauna but also the flora will be affected. But in all these relations, no serious and relevant research is done. While the public is deceived and lulled into a false sense of security with misrepresentations and lies regarding the alleged harmlessness of the radiations.
But it is also the case that the human beings today, just in Switzerland as everywhere else in the world, are mobile phone crazy and mobile phone addicted, in a completely pathological form. Consequently, they are damaged in their indifference with regard to their health, which is very much impaired by mobile phone radiation, mobile phone antennas and other mobile phone installations, to the point of endangering their lives. The whole issue of indifference to health, however, also arises in many other ways, such as in relation to dementia, which human beings often bring on themselves through their addictions and irrationality, which we have already discussed privately on several occasions. Particularly important are drugs, alcohol, and all kinds of poisons, which are taken by many human beings in an unconsidered and unreasonable way, or inhaled through smoking, which leads to many thousands of deaths every year and devours enormous amounts of health insurance money, whereby the health insurance premiums become higher and higher every year. But these health insurance premiums are also constantly increased because the elite of the medical profession wants to be paid ever more horrendously, which of course also drives up the hospital care costs for patient treatments, as well as the operating, administrative, and maintenance costs of the hospitals. For years, many human beings have no longer been able to pay their health insurance premiums and are constantly being pursued, up to the point of a certificate of loss, in order to ultimately end up on social welfare and become poor, as was once said in this regard. And it is effectively the case that these circumstances will continue to be rampant, and ultimately lead to a far-reaching collapse that can hardly be stopped. At least that's how I see it. But back to dementia, etc., because now scientists have also come to the same conclusion as I have, as can be seen from this article in the Tagesanzeiger published on the 28th of February, which Florina has also photographed and beamed to you.
Which I also read and have to say that its content is not detailed enough and is also not completely correct. It is correct that drinking a lot of alcohol causes serious and irreparable damage to the health of human beings, which in the worst case can lead to death. However, alcohol is not the main risk factor for dementia, as the article incorrectly states. But that alcohol, in connection with high blood pressure, diabetes, and smoking, as well as other health-damaging problems, also promotes dementia, is undoubtedly correct. The 5,834 toxic substances known to us which are released by smoking and which human beings inhale not only lead to death very often, tens of thousands of times every year worldwide, but also contribute to the development of many ailments, such as cancer, Alzheimer's disease and dementia, etc. What is not mentioned at all in this article, however, is the fact that dementia, in addition to various types of cancer and many long-lasting ailments and diseases, is fundamentally caused by toxic substances, which can be of various natural origins but which are also irresponsibly created by human beings. Toxic substances of natural origin, which emanate in gaseous form from plants, minerals, the earth and rocks, are absorbed by human beings just as unrecognized through the air we breathe. The food we eat and the drinking water we drink and have their damaging effect on health, as do the toxic substances created by human beings. However, in this progressive age of science, the earthly sciences do not yet devote themselves to this, because these facts are still completely unknown to them. All natural and also the toxic substances of all kinds created by human beings have the property that toxic gases are continuously secreted by them, spread in the air we breathe and also accumulate in water and all plants. However, this only happens in imperceptible and infinitesimally small quantities, which are hardly or not at all measurable, so that they are extremely difficult to detect with earthly technical equipment. Suspended in the air we breathe and ingested with food and drinking water, the human being's organism is poisoned, which also impairs the metabolism and thus inevitably causes health disorders. And the fact is, in this respect, that even the slightest, infinitesimal trace of a poison has a harmful and possibly ultimately fatal effect on every organism of every life form, be it human being, animal, creatures, or plant, etc. This, however, is denied by humans for the sake of money and profit, both by the manufacturers and users of the manifold toxins, but also by the health authorities, etc., who also for the sake of money, which corresponds to a crime against humanity, nature and its fauna and flora, declare the lowest amounts of toxins to be harmless for food and the health of human beings, etc., although even the smallest and infinitesimally smallest traces of a toxin have a harmful and ultimately lethal effect on every organism of every life form.
Thanks. That is also clear now, but it will probably not be of much use, because all those responsible in this regard will not care about that, but will continue to care only about their greed for money and their immense profit. But if you have already talked about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, could you explain briefly in a simple and generally understandable way what these diseases are? Because I think that the average citizen often hears a lot about them, but just as often does not know what they really are.
That may indeed be so, following which I will explain the following in brief. Alzheimer's disease. This is a progressive loss of nerve cells as well as a gradual shrinking of the brain mass. The loss of nerve cells also leads to the destruction of the transmission points between the nerve cells, which prevents the transmission and processing of information. Furthermore, the concentration of important neuronal messenger substances, such as acetylcholine in particular, is reduced, which leads to disturbances in information processing that cause severe learning problems and also impair memory. On the one hand, the destroyed nerve cells form fragments, are not completely broken down, and on the other hand, together with other proteins, form the Alzheimer's fibrils and Alzheimer's plaques in the brain, which are characteristic of the disease and correspond to deposits. Genetic factors may also play a causative role in the development of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease that occurs in its most common form in persons over the age of 60 and is characterized by increasing dementia. Dementia. Dementia is a higher term for a disease associated with a loss of the functions of consciousness. In particular, the thought-feeling world is impaired, whereby the fact of the impairment of the feeling world in dementia patients is still largely unknown to earthly medical science. Dementia also leads to a loss of memory and orientation, as well as the coordination of thought processes, which means that even everyday activities can no longer be carried out independently. These include Pick's disease, frontotemporal dementia, as well as other forms of dementia, such as vascular dementia, which develops due to circulatory disorders and leads to sudden deterioration of brain performance and stroke-like symptoms. Secondary dementia is also worth mentioning. It can take several forms and is caused by non-brain organic underlying diseases, although if the underlying diseases are treated successfully, the memory disorders can regress. These secondary forms of dementia can be caused by alcoholism, vitamin B12 deficiency, AIDS, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, meningitis, metabolic disorders, thyroid disorders, drugs, chronic poisoning, or infectious diseases. Alzheimer's dementia, however, is the most common form of dementia. In this case, disturbances occur in certain areas of the brain which destroy the balance of the messenger substance glutamate, and thus the nerve cells. That, Edward, should be enough, as a treatise would probably be too rambling.
It certainly would be, but thanks very much for your explanation.
English translation 704th Contact Part 2. Thursday, the 1st of March 2018, 21:54 hours.
Florina and Anjana have sent me some questions from you, as well as the long list of questions from Christian. To such questions, I have already told you once that you should not go into them anymore, because they are absolutely irrelevant for the mission, and therefore for the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and therefore also of no importance, and therefore not relevant with regard to the learning and knowledge of the teaching of truth, teaching of life, as well as the whole mission. Besides, such questions, on the one hand, give rise to further endless, irrelevant, unimportant, and only curiosity-serving new questionings, by which, on the other hand, if you answer them, you spend yourself uselessly, whereby, by answering you also fail to do more important work, as would also be the case if you were to engage in such a way with journalists, etc. And just in this respect, I want to tell you that you should continue to keep to it, really not to indulge in any more public relations of this or also of any other kind. What has had to be done in this respect, as in relation to some good journalists worthy of their profession, and the work with Wendell Stevens, Tom Welch and Lee Elders, etc., as well as Japan Television and the Contact film, that should be quite enough and not be repeated another time. You have done your necessary work in this respect at the time you began to spread and publicize your mission, and it has been done by you in a good, sufficient, and satisfactory manner. Consequently, nothing need be done by you again in the same or similar form. All public work of this kind is to be done and carried out only by your faithful, while you are to remain in the background. There would be no objection to such work and assignments of your faithful if you had to assist them with advice as well as missionary and consequently also doctrinal explanations.
Firstly, to all that you have said, I will say that I had already worked out the answers for the list of questions I had received from Christian before you recently told me that such questions should no longer be answered. And as far as interviews and displays, etc. are concerned, You know that I have not been available in this respect for a long time, but want to stay in the background. Moreover, you also know that I do not think much of it at all, and I do not like to be seen in public on television, in newspapers, magazines, and films, etc., because I'm not keen on showing myself off in private or in public like a zoo animal. This can be done by publicity-hungry human beings of all kinds, who want to be admired and who, in their own delusion of self-promotion and self-admiration, vegetate in a pathological state of unconsciousness. This is precisely because they think they are something special and worthy of adulation. They even adore themselves, and they are fundamentally a will-o'-the-wisp of themselves. And what is particularly important to say in this regard is that if I remain in the background, I can do my work in peace and do not have to be idolized by human beings who, as a result of wrong views and thoughts, want to see something special in me, which I, as a normal earthling, am in no way, but only a simple human being. But now I have another question, which comes from Christian's list of questions. Question 9. In this context and referring to the male principle mentioned in question 8, a small digression. In the Talmud Emmanuel, only the fathers are listed in the family tree. So, for example, Seth begat Enos. Enos begat Akshabil, etc., as is similarly the case with Petra, etc., who practically only names his male ancestors, but not their wives, the mothers of their descendants. What is the reason for this?
In our conversation so far, my male ancestors were only mentioned because they had to be mentioned in relation to their work on Earth and in relation to predictions for the future of Earth and Earth humans, but also in direct, indirect, or early connection with your mission and yourself. So there was no relation to their female partners in this respect. Consequently, there was no need to name their wives as well. If a woman played a significant role, as in the case of Caradwina in the story of Merlin, as well as my daughters Simyase and Plagia and Florena, and Jana and others in connection with you, then it is self-evident that their names are mentioned as well as when their mothers or husbands, etc., are mentioned. If, for example, I were to speak of my family tree, then it would go without saying that I would mention not only my father's line, but also my mother's lineage, as is customary and prescribed among us Pleyaren, and consequently, when we speak of the family tree, we mention both that of the wife and that of the husband in full connection. So the question part, as this is similarly the case with Petra, etc., who practically only names his male ancestors but not their wives, the mothers of their descendants, assumes a completely misunderstood premise.
Thanks. Then I now add Christian's questions and my answers to them here to our conversation.
Questions and answers about the Nokodemion lineage in the book Nokodemion, His Successor Personalities, and the Sevenfold Prophet series on Earth, by Bernadette Brand, which was published in an expanded and revised version in 2013 by the Aquarian Time Publishing House of the Figu. Questions about the development of Nokodemion are answered by Billy Edward Albert Meier under the title Emergence of the Mission, from page 71 onwards. In this regard, recently January 2018, seemingly contradictory interpretations concerning the frequency of the back and forth change of the Nokodemion spirit form between the immaterial plane Arahat-Athersata and the material plane in which we live have shown a need for explanation. In formulating the corresponding question, Kalezer, what has now happened is what was practically unavoidable in view of the immense dimensions of the subject matter. Namely that a whole chain of further questions has arisen, the answering of which would throw further light on the still hidden, enormously varied aspects, etc., of the universal annihilation. Therefore, the unique window of time in the course of the entire history of the Earth is to be used to obtain answers from the only reliable and competent source, namely from the enunciator of modern times, Billy Edward Albert Meier /Billy Edward Albert Meier, who is the bearer of the Nokodemion spirit form, has sole access to its knowledge, etc., stored in the memory banks, namely back over the whole 9.6 billion or 9,600 million years. a number that takes only a short time to pronounce, but behind which are hidden eons and eons, an enormous duration that overtaxes any human imagination. But before the questions are formulated, a few data from the above-mentioned book should be recapitulated for the understanding of the readership. The Dern universe with its 7 universe belts has already been in the expansion phase, lasting a total of 155.5 trillion years, for 46 trillion years, which is then followed by an equally long contraction phase. About 10 billion years ago, the first human beings emerged in our Dern universe, namely in the 4th universe belt, the solid-state universe. Approximately 400 million years later, the Nokodemion spirit form began its course of development through many reincarnations and as different personalities during 52 million years before Nokodemion, after a last material life of 1,763 years. Continued to evolve for a further 56 million years via the semi-material level High Council, until he or the Nokodemion spirit form entered the pure spirit level Arahat Athersata. After 8.7 million years of further development in the Arahat Athersata spirit plane, a process of accumulation began that lasted over 1.2 billion years, and led to the spirit energy impulse knowledge of a universal cause, after which the Nokodemion spirit form returned to the material world via the semi-material plane High Council, and subsequently taught the peoples and most distant descendants of the first Nokodemion as various personalities for 52 million years. And now follows the information that requires a special explanation on the part of Billy Edward Albert Meier. Quote, after that, the Nokodemion spirit form went back and forth several times between the material world, the High Council, the plane Arahat Athersata, and the material world again, until 1.3 billion years ago. That was the time when the Nokodemion spirit form returned from the plane of Arahat Athersata and the plane of High Council for the last time, in order to inspire new human bodies again and again up to the present day. Question 1. Now how is this several times back and forth to be understood, since the Nokodemion spirit form has apparently, as you recently confirmed, returned from the spirit plane Arahat Athersata to the material plane only once after all? That is to say, has existed in the material world for 9.6 billion years?
Answer: the back and forth between the material world, High Council, the plane Arahat Athersata, and again the material world, did not take place, according to the memory bank version, through a death of Nokodemion, but solely in a form of a spirit energy impulse migration, by which it can be understood that a process took place in which a communicative, impulse-like spirit energy connection took place between Nokodemion and the plane's High Council and Arahat Athersata. Similarly, this could be explained by telepathy, when two human beings communicate telepathically over vast distances, such as between distant planets.
Question 2. Nokodemion was the first human being from our Dern universe, whose spirit form evolved via the half-spirit level High Council into the spirit level Arahat Athersata, and took over the task of a universal covenant. Was this the case because the Nokodemion spirit form, from its first incarnation in a human body 9.6 billion years ago, was predestined by a law of creation to one day enter the already existing planes High Council and Arahat Athersata as the first spirit form? Or did this denunciation only result from the first appearance of the spirit form in the Arahat Athersata plane? Or was it for other reasons, or a combination of several, that the Nokodemion spirit form took on, or was required to take on, the universal annunciation?
Answer: true prophets, respectively, heralds and sages, as a rule, arise from the peoples of the respective planets, namely by themselves recognizing the creational natural laws and recommendations in the causality and in the becoming and passing away of nature. the fauna and flora, the climate, the universe, the human beings, and all existing things in general. Real, truthful prophets are human beings who, as reality thinkers and truth thinkers, only perceive, recognize, and acknowledge effective reality and the truth that emerges from it. In this form, they become knowers who work out the essence of their knowledge into wisdom and thus become sages. By coming among human beings, they instruct them and, as wise men and heralds, spread their knowledge of the creational natural laws and recommendations which they, as seekers of reality and truth, have themselves perceived, recognized, and elaborated into knowledge and wisdom. In their knowledge and wisdom, it is given that they are also in many ways calculating in advance and recognize what effects certain causes bring, just as they recognize it from the causality of all things. From this then arise prophecies which show that certain effects result from certain causes. As a rule, however, only negative effects are prophesied for the instruction of human beings, for the purpose that human beings should learn to improve the negative causes through progressive actions, deeds, and behavior in order to avoid the prophesied negative effects and, on the contrary, to bring about something better and good. True prophets, who never misteach religious and sectarian nonsense, but are solely attached to reality and its truth, thus always stand out from the peoples of the respective world, whereby they are completely normal human beings from birth and acquire all their knowledge and wisdom and love, etc., absolutely through their own conscious and responsible efforts. Thus they are not guided or instructed and taught from birth by human beings of other star and planetary systems, but only by themselves. True prophets or heralds, who are also called wise men in the vernacular, are fundamentally completely normal human beings who learn and work out their prophethood and heraldry of their own accord and interest, in order to instruct their fellow human beings and to draw their attention to the fact that they should exist and live according to the creational natural laws and recommendations, commandments = recommendations that result from the existence and life of nature and that are suggestive and influential in the life of the human being. Commandments = recommendations that arise from the existence and life of nature, and have a suggestive or influencing effect on human beings in such a way that they can learn from them and exist and lead their lives in a creative and natural way. In this way, true prophets founders lead human beings on the path of perception, self-thinking, self-decision-making, self-learning, self-knowledge, self-action, and the exercise of self-responsibility, etc., in principle. However, all human beings and other life forms, which are ordered to a conscious development of consciousness, are normally capable of learning everything for themselves out of their own ability and strength, as well as in their own interest and with their own understanding, as well as with their own reason and free will. In the case of the sifting of the earthly prophets from the Nokodemion line, however, history leads back to a human being of extraterrestrial origin, namely to the universal prophet Nokodemion, who had created relations with Earth and consequently also came here and exercised his prophethood. In this sequence, his spirit form reincarnated 7 times in different personalities who appeared in his spirit form line as Nokodemion following prophets. See book Nokodemion by Bernadette Brand. Wassermannsate Verlag, Figu. Now, however, a defining word is probably still to be said with regard to wisdom, in order to make it comprehensible. Effective wisdom is a universal human ability that is timeless. It is characterized by an unusually deep insight and knowledge of the structure of existence, of nature, of fauna and flora, of life, of society, as well as by a special knowledge of life experience, general psychological understanding, and especially also of the creational natural laws and recommendations. For a truly wise human being, the high values of existence and life are of very special value, above all the creational natural laws and recommendations, as well as all virtues and natural humanity. Thus, a human being to whom wisdom is inherent has given himself to an outstanding ethical moral basic attitude as well as to all the associated ways of acting and behaving. In addition, real wisdom in human beings testifies to an extraordinary flexibility and independence of thought. feeling, and consciousness, as a result of which they are capable of systematically thinking through all things, gaining wise knowledge, and making wise decisions and judgments. Consequently, a human being capable of wisdom can form wise words, give wise advice, and behave wisely. A truly wise human being also thinks and acts more logically than is the case with a so-called ordinary mortal without a good general education, because the latter thinks things through less thoroughly and less profoundly, precisely because the necessary facts do not occur to him as a result of his lack of education. If the wisdom of a human being is considered more closely and in comprehensive appreciation of all circumstances, then it can be seen that there is also a creative causal foresight which sometimes only proves to be correct in true utterances, counsels, and reflections at intervals of time or space. Similarly, this applies to some actions and deeds that are correct, or only prove to be correct in the future. Correspondingly, correctness also applies to words that a human being capable of wisdom does not utter after careful consideration, or to actions or deeds that he does not do because he knows very well that every spoken word, action, or deed would be too much and completely wrongly appropriate.
Question 3. I seem to recall that you once spoke of the High Council and Arahat Athasata planes existing before the first entry of the first human spirit form, because the structural building of the universe through the creation of universal consciousness took place at the very beginning. Does this mean that the plane's High Council to Petra already existed during the first 46 trillion years, but was still empty or quasi-unused during this long time, comparable to a newly built schoolhouse that is ready to receive the first pupils, but where teachers have nevertheless prepared what is necessary in the classrooms to enable a good learning field for the pupils appearing from the beginning?
Answer. All levels, from Arahat Athasata to Pata Li in the creation universal consciousness, as in every new creation universal consciousness, which as the lowest form of creation emerges from the absolute absolutum or from a primordial creation and, as the only form of creation has a matter belt and thus also material life, are fundamentally given and contain the necessary basic energetic evolutive impulses, which however lie dormant until they become active through new spirit energy impulses flowing in from outside.
Question 4. Before the Nokodemion spirit form entered the Arahat Athasata spirit plane as the first spirit form, the spirit forms of those human beings already existed who had lived 400 million years before the first incarnation of the Nokodemion spirit form. Considering today's time frame of 40-60 million years of evolution in the material realm, was the pace of development of the first human being somehow slowed down or otherwise artificially influenced, etc., since the Nokodemion spirit form, which appeared much later, was the first to enter the pure spirit plane? Or did the first human lineages die out from time to time and could therefore only complete their evolution in the material realm in Nokodemion's time?
Answer. Note also the answer to question 1. With regard to the first to enter the pure spirit plane, the answer from the Nokodemion memory bank version is also the following. The back and forth between the material world, High Council, the plane Arahat Athasata, and again the material world, did not take place through a death of Nokodemion, but solely in a form of a spirit energy impulse migration, by which can be understood that a process took place in which a communicative impulse-like spirit energy connection between Nokodemion and the plane's High Council and Arahat Athasata took place. This could be explained in parable with telepathy, when two human beings communicate telepathically over vast distances, such as between distant planets. When Nokodemion came into existence about 9.6 billion years ago, many millions of years before, peoples already existed on the planet where he was born, from whom, of course, innumerable spirit forms had already entered higher planes, as was also the case with those ancestor peoples who lived millions and billions of years before these peoples. At that time, the material universe or the matter belt had already renewed itself X times without transition almost 1,000 times, which happens every 49 billion years. Nokodemion was therefore born in the present creation of universal consciousness, which has already existed for 46 trillion years, and whose present matter belt was renewed without transition about 17 billion years ago. And as is taught, human beings and other life forms have also existed and developed in these past times over 46 trillion years in the matter belt or matter universe, which is constantly renewing itself in the course of 49 billion years, and have entered the High Council and then the Arahat Atharsata level, and from this again into the still higher levels. The levels High Council and Arahat Atharsata were therefore already enlivened by innumerable spirit forms or spirit impulse forms, which during the 46 trillion years of the universe's existence had emerged as life forms from the matter belt, which had already been renewed almost 1,000 times without transition, and had evolved. Nokodemion was only born about 9.6 billion years ago in the matter belt or matter universe, which was completely renewed about 17 billion years ago and therefore also exists today, after which he had thus formed himself into a prophet or herald, and was active as a prophet herald until his death, after which his spirit form was the first to wander, or first to enter the High Council level and then the Arahat Atharsata pure spirit level. The first does not mean, however, that it was the first spirit form to cross over to the higher planes, for by first it must be understood that when the Nokodemion spirit form entered the pure spirit plane Arahat Atharsata, it was the first fusion of the Nokodemion spirit form with the pure spirit plane. After the completion of the mission, the Nokodemion spirit form will enter the pure spirit plane Arahat Atharsata as the second, which means that it will integrate into the Arahat Atharsata plane for the second time. After the death of the first material body of Nokodemion, his spirit form thus wandered, as first, that is to say the first time on the natural progression into the High Council level and afterwards into the Arahat Atharsata level. From this plane, however, it returned to the material world and revived a personality which again bore the name Nokodemion and established a new prophetic heraldic mission which continues to this day and will not come to an end until the year 3999. After that, the Nokodemion spirit form will enter the plane of Arahat Atharsata as second, or for the second time, and integrate into it.
Question 5. Since it is unlikely that all the millions or billions of peoples in the universe who ever develop in the universe will come into contact with the spiritual teachings specifically founded by Nokodemion at least once during their development through living, dying and rebirth, it is probably predetermined by the laws of creation that all human beings will sooner or later come of their own accord to the point where they learn to decipher the laws and recommendations of creation and thereby develop upwards into the spiritual planes. But local heralds or teachers are necessary at all times. That is to say, an instruction of the ignorant or little knowing by the more knowing or much knowing.
Answer. This question has already been clarified in answer number 2.
Question 6. The levels High Council, as well as Arahat Atharsata to Pa-Ta Li, most probably also exist in every other universe or creation universal consciousness, but are probably called by other names by the human beings living there, right?
Answer. The levels High Council as well as Arahat Atharsata to Pa-Ta Li exist as already explained in answer 3 in every creation universal consciousness. The terms, names, designations, and words used on earth in relation to the teaching of the prophets, the teaching of the Spirit, that is to say the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life correspond to those used by the prophet Enunciator Nokodemion in his language, and which have been transposed by me according to today's German understanding of the language. Consequently, it should be clear that human beings and other life forms of other worlds and languages that are capable of articulating use other terms, names, designations, and words than those that I have implemented and used from the vocabulary of Nokodemion. In the earthly languages alone, translations have to take place, but for certain terms, names, designations, and words in other earthly languages there are often no translation possibilities, because these are very poor in expression and lack the extensive possibilities of the German language variety of terms, designations, and words.
Question 7. You have already confirmed once that there is a universal founder in every universe, so also in the DAL universe. But is it also the case in every other universe that the designated universal annunciator already gathers human beings around him in his first phase of existence, that is to say, before he first enters the Arahat Athasata plane, teaches them, and of course also begets offspring himself, so that spirit teaching peoples develop from them, and thereby the chance of an acceleration of evolution arises for human beings in the universe concerned?
Answer. This question contains more than just a simple question. Consequently, it also requires a far more detailed answer, because in its entirety this question conceals a whole complex of questions that must be answered by getting to the bottom of it. 1. With regard to the term universal conjurer, it must be clearly explained that this term is obviously misunderstood, because a universal prophet or universal conjurer is a human being who is born on a world where he or she forms himself or herself to be a prophet or a preacher and is active on his or her own planet as a prophet or preacher, and thus spreads the teachings he or she has worked out. Basically, the teachings are not taught and spread throughout the universe but on one's own world. 2. What is to be understood with regard to the universal? This means that the teaching must be universal. That is to say, universe-wide. That is to say, creatively universally valid and founded in the universal laws and recommendations of creation universal consciousness. The universal thus clearly states that the prophetic preaching and wise teaching is equally given, definitely established, binding, obligatory, unquestionable, and correct and indisputable according to the laws of creation. 3. In rare cases, as is the case with Nokodemion, a universal prophet or universal herald actually carries the prophetic heraldic activity out into the universe and thus spreads the teaching universally on other worlds than just on the home planet. Only in this way can a prophet/universal annunciator be called universally active, which is a rarity, because in order to be active as a universal prophet, universal annunciator in this way, the absolute condition must be fulfilled that space travel must be given and mastered. Every prophet universal annunciator, as well as every other true prophet annunciator, gathers human beings around him in order to instruct them, because this is, after all, his task and duty. In the case of a universal prophet universal annunciator, his activity in spreading his teaching to other worlds is always dependent on the extent to which he has the possibility of reaching other planets to carry out his teaching. So there are prophets founders who could be active in a universal way, because they would be universal prophets and founders according to their knowledge, their insights and wisdom. But they cannot practice universal prophethood founding because they do not have the necessary possibilities to reach other worlds. With regard to Nokodemion, the whole thing was a special case in that there was already a very high level of technical development among his peoples in his time, which enabled them to go out into the vastness of the universe and even penetrate into other dimensions. This also happened in such a way that the Nokodemion teaching, or the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, was brought to earth and can also still be taught today. Very often, universal prophets/founders or even sages remain planet-bound because they lack all possibilities to be able to work in the vastness of the universe. Consequently, they spread their knowledge as prophets, founders on their world alone, and as a rule also teach only one people. Explanation with regard to prophets and heralds. In principle, every rational human being is capable of perceiving everything in free nature and its fauna and flora, of observing it closely and of recognizing from it the creational natural laws and recommendations, in order to use them in a consequent positive way for himself, to create creatively naturally within oneself the values of morality, ethics and morality correctly. in order to then live these outwardly as correct forms of morality, ethics and morality through correspondingly positive behavior. Actions and deeds commandments related to the understanding and reason of human beings = recommendations. In relation to the creational natural commandments, the commandments correspond to causality or the consistency of cause and effect. The consistency of cause and effect. Note, ethics = morality, ethos = moral attitude. If the human being follows the creational natural laws and recommendations, which he independently recognizes and learns in free nature and its fauna and flora and in all creational natural existence, then he gradually becomes a knowing and wise human being, who first of all uses his knowledge and wisdom for his own benefit, too, but also passes on his knowledge and wisdom to his fellow human beings. And this passing on takes place in various ways. On the one hand, through education, in which the acquired knowledge and its essence or wisdom is imparted to the offspring or other children as well as adults. On the other hand, the acquired knowledge and the wisdom resulting from it are passed on through simple conversations, in which the acquired knowledge is interwoven. But the whole of knowledge and wisdom is also passed on in schools and through lectures, books, writings, courses of instruction, and public proclamations. And if this fact is considered carefully, then every normal human being, male or female, is more or less a prophet, herald, and teacher. If the human being acquires the necessary knowledge and the resulting essence, the wisdom, through understanding and reason, and then passes on the whole of his learning in this respect to his fellow human beings in some good, positive and valuable way, and also explains the natural creational laws, then he is a teacher or herald. If he also explains in a comprehensible way the causality or the effect that inevitably arises from a cause, then this corresponds to a factor that is prophesied according to acting and arriving facts, and is consequently called prophetic and predicted as something future. Which, however, has nothing to do with fortune-telling, because prophecy is based on facts of causality. A prophet prophesies the truth among human beings and explains what results from a cause as an effect, whereby a warning is given, prophetically or prophesying or predicting, to turn back to the better and the good, if bad consequences and evil degenerations, etc., will result from a cause through wrong thoughts, actions, and deeds. And if we look at the whole thing in this way, then we must understand that every normal human being who has a clear mind and clear reason, who also has a good, general knowledge and the resulting wisdom concerning the creative and natural laws and recommendations and their work and causal effects, is also a herald if he brings his wisdom to the attention of his fellow human beings and teaches them. And such a human being is also a prophet, if he understands and uses the creational natural commandments and causality in order to prophesy and explain their work to his fellow human beings. Thus, prophetically, that is to say prophesying, it is prophesied or predicted what will ultimately result from a certain evil, negative, bad, evil cause as an even worse and worse effect, if after the bad created cause is continued in the same negative framework, which then inevitably results in the effect. What basically prophecies and predictions are: 1. As a rule, prophecies have been made since time immemorial only as warnings and therefore in a negative way. The reason being that human beings think about them and change everything bad and negative for the better, good, and progressive. 2. Prophecies are based on inspirations, dreams, visions, or calculations of probability and indicate future events and happenings that will result from certain behaviors, attitudes, speeches and deeds, etc., if they are carried out and maintained in an unchanged manner over a period of time, whereby the period of time until the fulfillment of the prophecy can be short-term or even last for centuries or millennia. 3. If, however, all the factors of events, happenings and behavior, attitudes, speeches and deeds, etc. are not maintained, which are addressed by a prophecy, but are changed for the better and good, then it will not be fulfilled, because from the changes advantageously successful, fruitful, progressive, and valuable things will come forth. As a repetition in a different way of explanation, it cannot be explained enough what the prophet denunciation and everything connected with it is all about, so that everything is understood correctly and no misunderstandings arise. It must therefore be clearly explained that prophets and prophetesses emerge from the peoples themselves, and are therefore born as absolutely normal, rational human beings who then learn their knowledge and wisdom from the laws and recommendations of nature and its fauna and flora on their own initiative, and then responsibly preach among their fellow human beings and their peoples in an instructive and admonishing manner. True prophets or heralds of both sexes are not human beings appointed by an imaginary god to proclaim an allegedly divine truth among human beings. Consequently, they also do not exhort people to repentance in an allegedly divine mission to prevent bad consequences of evil actions. True prophets or heralds of both sexes learn and act on their own initiative, responsibility, and philanthropy, as well as for the preservation of life, nature, and its fauna and flora, and also for the creation of true peace, love, freedom, and justice. What true prophets, prophetesses, heralds internally are not, do or do not do. The term prophet comes from Greek and means herald, spokesperson, etc. With regard to prophethood, there is no particular type of personality or character, so it may be that a woman or man at a younger age initially considers himself or herself unsuitable and therefore decides to become a prophet or preacher at a later age. 1. True prophets and heralds are not men or women who are called by an imaginary god with a name, and are supposed to proclaim the alleged words of God to a people or a certain person. 2. True prophets, heralds, and preachers are not chosen by an imaginary god to be prophets. Heralds and preachers who reveal to other human beings alleged divine intentions and plans that are supposed to clarify the will of God. 3. True prophets and heralds do not feel called and commissioned by a non-existent God and are free from any religious and sectarian beliefs. 4. There is no deity that can manifest itself through human beings as prophets or heralds. 5. True prophets and heralds do not have a strong sense of mission, nor do they distinguish themselves in any way as religious, sectarian, or godly. 6. True prophets and heralds do not teach their knowledge and wisdom, and thus also the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life to fellow human beings and peoples in the form of persuasion, and thus not through a suggestive power of persuasion that dupes fellow human beings. As is the case with religions and sects, this is done, on the contrary, by religions and sects, politics, the military, and various organizations, but rather in detail and factual explanations, as well as through speech and answer, so that fellow human beings can understand everything, learn from it, and change positively and become true human beings. 7. True prophets and heralds do not teach humility to their fellow human beings and peoples, but rather conscious independence, independent and responsible action in absolute self-responsibility according to their own free will and their own decisions. No ideology. True prophets and heralds do not proclaim any ideology, but the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life according to the creational, naturally given laws and recommendations, which can be perceived and learned as well as followed in the entire existence of all existence of nature, its fauna and flora, as well as in the vastness of the universe or creation universal consciousness. A defining word concerning true prophet-conjurers and prophet-conjurers who are female and male. Sages. True prophets and prophetesses are female and male sages who, as a rule, arise from the peoples of the respective planets, namely by themselves perceiving and recognizing the creational natural laws and recommendations, in the causality and in the coming into being and passing away of nature, the fauna and flora, the climate, the universe, the human beings, and all existing things in general, and by understanding them in their value as laws and recommendations and following them to the best of their ability. Real, truthful prophet counselors are basically quite normal human beings who, however, as reality thinkers and truth thinkers, only perceive, recognize, acknowledge, and live according to the effective realistic reality and the truth arising from it. In this form they become true knowers who work out the essence of their knowledge into wisdom and thus become sages. As such, they then come among human beings and instruct them by announcing and spreading their knowledge of the creational natural laws and recommendations as wise men and heralds. just as they themselves, as seekers of reality and truth, have perceived, recognized, learned, and elaborated everything into knowledge and wisdom. It is given to them in their knowledge and wisdom that they are also able to calculate in advance in many relationships by means of causal probability calculations and know what effects certain causes bring about. Just as they recognize everything from the causality of all things that take place between cause and effect. From this then arise prophecies, which arise from what courses of action take place between cause and effect, which then set forth what certain effects take place from the certain causes. As a rule, however, only negative effects from negative causes are presented as prophecies for the instruction of human beings, namely for the purpose that human beings should learn to improve the negative causes through better, good, positive, value-bearing progressive actions, deeds, and behavior in order to avoid the prophesied negative effects and, on the contrary, to bring about better and good ones. True prophets and prophetesses never mislead religious and sectarian nonsense or any untruths, just as they also do not practice fortune-telling, but their predictions are based solely on reality and its truth and are only connected with it. On the one hand, this sets them far apart from fortune-tellers, just as they stand out from the peoples of the world as true prophets and prophetesses. What is special about them is only that they stand out from birth as quite normal human beings only by acquiring all their knowledge and wisdom and love, etc., absolutely through their own conscious and responsible efforts. So they are not guided or instructed and taught from birth by human beings of other star and planetary systems, but only by themselves. Predictions are made through true dreams, true visions, through real foresight or future consciousness wandering or future consciousness sensitivity, through which the real future is seen, as well as through time leaps or time travels into the future. The resulting views of the future are based on events that will effectively occur in the future and cannot possibly be changed.
Question 8. You have also confirmed that a universal founder during his last material life can also be of female sex. Consequently, in the universe in question, we would then speak of a Simyase spirit form, or a universal founder, for example. However, based on the fact that on Earth, the line of the 7 heralds from Enoch onwards is only composed of men, this is at best connected with the fact that the male principle polarities positive equal sign man and negative equal sign woman, not meant in a judgmental way, plays a role, or that this male bias is rather based on the fact that on Earth, because of the patriarchy or the dominance of men, which still prevails today, a prophetess is not available. Or the dominance of men. A female prophet or herald would have had even greater problems than those already known to be accepted by the human beings of that time as the bringer of a good teaching, the spiritual teaching.
Answer: that the Nokodemion prophet-Conjurer lineage was and is thoroughly masculine, finds its reason in the fact that since all the beginning and at the time of Nokodemion, the degenerations of the male sex were such that there was no possibility that a prophetic candling work could have been carried out by a female force. Basically, the form of Nokodemion prophet heraldry by a female would have had absolutely no chance throughout the ages and would have been degraded, degraded, defiled, and defiled, to say the least, by the male world. Foreseeing this, the level Arahat Atharsata took this fact into account and directed everything in such a way that with regard to the prophetic heraldic lineage of the Nokodemion, this should be of male gender throughout. This was due to the extremely serious and malicious negative degeneration of men from time immemorial, to whom women were no more than oppressed slaves and objects of use, which was to continue in this way far into the future. And when the sad history of oppression, bondage, enslavement, abuse, sexual and other abuses and every form of exploitation and exploitation of women by a bulk of the male world is considered from time immemorial to the present day, the fact still remains in many cases. The fact is that harassment, malicious torture, pimping and torture, trafficking in women and girls, and forced prostitution still exist and are practiced by unscrupulous men as they have been since time immemorial. And this is still happening today in the third millennium in all countries on Earth, as well as has been the case since time immemorial, that women have no rights vis-a-vis men, religion, and sometimes even the state, and are not subordinated to any equality and equal rights, and consequently women are not paid equally but less when they do the same work as men. Even today, the majority of the world of men, as in primeval times, is full of emotion, violence, trade, action, behavior, etc., and nothing is apparent with regard to a change for the better in that large part of the world of men, which has still completely degenerated and fallen into depravity. This was already the case at the time of Nokodemion, and in the same way it is still the case today in a large part of the world of men, and will also remain so into the distant future without any prospect of a rapid improvement, as a result of which these conditions will change for the better, and positive only extremely slowly. It was also clear to the Arahat author Sada level that the male prophecy founder lineage would also be exposed to great dangers, as well as that in the very distant future, positive successes would finally emerge from the very difficult, extensive and dangerous efforts over billions of years, and that little by little individual human beings would turn to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, and slowly lead everything to the better. It has been noted that many female and male prophetic heraldic sages will contribute greatly to this, for which, however, billions of years have been provided. And indeed, throughout the ages, there have always been women who have achieved a great deal, but who were not recognized as prophets/heralds, or only very rarely and superficially, if they did not even lose their lives or simply disappear into oblivion.
Question 9. In this context and with reference to the male principle mentioned in question 8, a short digression. In the Talmud and manual, only the fathers are listed in the family tree. For example, Seth begat Enos. Enos begat Achbeel, etc., as is similarly the case with Petra, etc., who practically only names his male ancestors but not their wives, the mothers of their descendants. What is the reason for this?
Answer. This question concerning the masculine principle should be answered with the answer to question 8, whereby this principle has been preserved up to the present time in the peoples of the earth, precisely in the form that the male world has always been placed in the foreground and continues to be emphasized in the same way in various states. This principle was also still valid at the time of Emmanuel, and was therefore recorded and handed down in the Talmud Emmanuel until the present day. In Switzerland, there have been repeated efforts by the people and ultimately also by the government for decades to change these grievances for the better, as was evident, for example, in the matter of naming in 2013, when the new naming law also allowed women to have their say. The old traditional naming system in Switzerland was still very traditional, which meant that when a woman married, she had to take on and bear her husband's family name. The following was written about this at the time, which can be read on the internet at Wikipedia. The new law, which is to come into force in 2013, now wants to put an end to this. From then on, married couples will have a wide choice of how they want to deal with their names. The current name regulation. Until now, the husband's name was automatically considered the family name if the bride and groom had not applied for another. If the bride's name was to become the family name, an application had to be made to the government of the canton of residence stating the reasons for this wish. However, the regulation was handled very benevolently. Also permissible under this regulation is a double name, in which the spouse changing names may put his or her single name before the family name. The hyphen, however, is taboo, even though it may be used in everyday life. The transitional regulation. Anyone who changed their name when they married can declare to the Civil Registry Office until the 31st of December 2013 that they wish to adopt their married name again. If there are children, the parents can declare until this date that they should also bear the single name. If the parents are not married but jointly exercise parental care, they can also declare until 31.12. 2013 that the child should bear the same maiden name as the father. Older children from the age of 12 have the right to refuse or agree to this. A same-sex couple whose partnership has been registered may declare until the end of 2013 that they wish to choose the single name of one or the other partner as their joint family name. The new regulation as of 1.1. 2013. The new regulation provides that the bride and groom automatically keep their single names. However, they can also choose one of the married names as their joint family name. By the way, this also applies to same-sex couples who want to register their partnership. There are various options for naming the children. If the parents have a common name, the children also receive this as their family name. If the parents have different names, the children receive the name that the parents have chosen as their family name. The children of unmarried parents automatically receive the mother's single name. However, if the parents exercise parental care jointly, they can also choose the father's single name as the name for the child. The new regulation means that both spouses retain citizenship and that a child also receives citizenship that corresponds to that of the parent giving the name. The innovations will be introduced as of 1.1. 2013 with the aim of ensuring the equality of spouses in the area of naming and citizenship rights. Now, as for the matter regarding the male principle among the Plejaren, with Ptah practically naming only his male ancestors, he stated the following on the 1st of March 2018. In our conversation so far, my male ancestors were only mentioned because they were to be mentioned in relation to their work on Earth, and in terms of predictions for the future of Earth and Earth humans, as well as in direct, indirect, or early connection with your mission and yourself. So there was no relation to their female partners, so there was no need to mention their wives. If a woman played a significant role, as in the case of Caridwena in the story of Merlin, as well as my daughters Simyase and Pleja and Florena, and Jana and others in connection with you, then it is self-evident that their names are mentioned in the same way as when their mothers or husbands etc. are mentioned. If, for example, I were to speak of my family tree, then it would be self-evident that I would mention not only my father's lineage, but also my mother's lineage, as is customary and prescribed among us Plejaren. Consequently, when we speak of the family tree, we mention both that of the wife and that of the husband in full context. So the question part, as this is similarly the case with Ptah etc., who practically only names his male ancestors but not their wives, the mothers of their descendants is based on a completely misunderstood premise.
Question 10. Of the peoples living in the Tao universe, the Sonar are known to us as the most highly evolved people. Are they given the knowledge of the universal founder spirit form responsible for their universe? Or are they even aware of the bearer, or bearer if any, in life from the universal founder spirit form lineage there?
Answer. The Sonar are the most evolved peoples in the Tao universe. To which Ptah explained the following during a conversation he once had in private. The Sonar peoples are the oldest known to us, and have been living in peace since time immemorial in the Tao universe. They also had prophets and heralds at a very early time, but in a different way than in the Dern universe. Because at a very early time the Sonar peoples had two wise men, namely a prophetess or herald who was called Nisei, while the prophet or herald was called Alkan. The Taimars split off from the Sonar peoples and formed themselves into a separate line of peoples, whereby they continued to cultivate the teachings of the old sages, Nisei and Alkan. In later times they mixed with distant ancestors from ancient Plejaren families, who came to the Tao universe and joined forces with the Taimars. As a result, the teaching of Nokodemion also reached the Taimars and the Sonaren. And because this teaching harmonized with that of Nisei and Alkan, the two largely identical teachings were combined and henceforth taught among the Taimars and Sonar peoples, and adhered to up to the present time and will undoubtedly be adhered to in the future for all time. Fundamentally, then, it can be said that the prophetic heraldic teaching of the Sonar and Taimars is identical with the teaching of truth. Teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life as taught from time immemorial and also brought to earth through the Nokodemion series of prophets.
Question 11. If we consider the personalities of the past few centuries who have been animated on Earth by the Nokodemion spirit form, it is noticeable that between the individual material lives, there were only relatively short stays in the beyond realm. That is to say, a great deviation from the normal ratio naturally given on Earth. This then looks as follows. Person born, developed years, lived years in the beyond. Johann Georg Faust 1480-1541, 6123 Galileo Galilei 15. 2.15, 64 8.1. 1642, 78, 114. Perhaps another person. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart 27.1. 1756, 5.12. 1791, 3518. Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, 3.2. 1809, 4.11. 1847, 48, 22. Grigory J. Rasputin, 21.1. 1869, 30.12. 1916, 47, 22. Edouard A. Meier, 3.2. 1937.
Answer: all these men had special tasks and abilities which brought progressive values for the next centuries in many ways, which, however, were not immediately recognizable as such, but were of such significance that from them more sensible and comprehensive research was carried out in the sciences concerned, and new valuable as well as progressive knowledge reaching into the future was gained, and the rapid development into modern times could find its progress in a purposeful way. Johann Georg Faust was born on 3.2, 1479 and died on 27.2, 1541. He worked as a chemist, which at that time was called an alchemist. As a herbalist, he prepared natural medicines from medicinal plants and used them to cure physical illnesses in human beings and animals. But he also used his effective natural remedies for the mentally ill, which earned him a reputation as a healer and miracle worker. As an expert on the function and values of consciousness and its workings, which he still had to call spirit, according to the understanding of the human beings of that time, he also spoke openly about the energetic vibrational forces arising from it, which was not yet understood by the human beings at that time but was considered magic. Consequently, he was also considered a magician. As an active astrologer, however, he was mainly concerned with astronomy and thus with the structure, the existence, and the whole work in the universe, whereby he also spoke openly about this and made astronomic calculations. He was also fundamentally concerned with the future of the Earth and its human beings, as a result of which he made probability calculations and causal predictions in accordance with the law of causality, which is why he was also called a fortune teller by ignorant and non-understanding human beings. Galileo Galilei was the actual originator of the astronomical discoveries, whereby he played a decisive role in establishing the heliocentric worldview developed by the canon Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473-1543, as a universally valid doctrine. He developed and constructed the hydrostatic balance for measuring density, and he also made many inventions that contributed to future development in many ways, and made many new technical and other discoveries possible. He was also progressive culturally, also as a painter and mathematician, etc. He laid the foundation for modernity. He laid the foundation for modern astronomy. What is also important to create a good picture and understanding of Galileo Galilei is what can be found on Wikipedia. Academic career and scientific achievements. As early as 1586, Galileo had designed a hydrostatic balance for measuring density. In 1589, he took over the chair of mathematics in his hometown of Pisa, before moving to Padua as a professor in 1592. During his time in Padua, he set up a workshop and began to carry out precision mechanical experiments. In the course of this work, Galileo not only constructed the first proportional compass, but also calculated the laws of the thread pendulum and further developed the telescope, which had only recently been invented in the Netherlands. With his technically improved telescope, which was considerably more precise with a magnification of 20 times, he began to observe the moon and some planets and to study their surface structures. In the spring of 1610, in the course of his regular observations, he realized that neither the moon nor the earth shone independently. At the same time, he succeeded in using the telescope to describe the nature of the Milky Way and the surface of the moon. By chance, he also noticed that 4 stars surrounding Jupiter were suddenly no longer visible. He could not explain this phenomenon and therefore studied old star charts. He assumed that the 4 moons of Jupiter must be covered by the planet. This observation contradicted the Aristotelian doctrine of the geocentric view of the world, which was generally valid at that time and was also advocated by the Roman Catholic Church. He named the moons of Jupiter the Medici Sidera, in honor of the Tuscan Duke Cosimo de' Medici II. Through his observations, Galileo began to think about the constellation of the planets and Nicolaus Copernicus's assumption that the Earth was not at the center of the universe and surrounded by celestial bodies, as had been assumed, but revolved around the Sun. He further developed his intensive study of Copernicus's heliocentric view of the world, and found a possible explanation for the tides, which alternated depending on the Earth's movements. The studies he conducted in his workshop led him to develop a new idea based on a solar-centered system of planets. Galileo published his scientific findings in 1610 in his work Siderus Nuncius, in German Sternenbotschaft. His theory and scientific treatises were not initially rejected in Rome but were actually confirmed. In 1611 he visited Pope Paul V in Rome and during his stay was appointed a member of the ecclesiastical Accademia dei Lincei. At the same time, Galileo was elevated by the Grand Duke of Medici in Florence to the position of first philosopher and court mathematician for his outstanding astronomical discoveries. This position freed him from any teaching duties and allowed him to concentrate fully on his research. His discoveries, which in later years also included the Saturn ring and the sunspots, were received with enthusiasm in some quarters, but with great skepticism by the followers of Aristotle's teachings. It was not until 1613, after his teachings had become more widespread and increasingly called into question the geocentric worldview represented in the Bible, that his findings were labeled heretical and foolish by the Holy Office. The Medici family also increasingly rejected Copernicus's theory and Galileo's findings as heretical. Galileo reacted to these developments by publishing an open letter in which he emphasized the contrast between the contents of biblical texts and scientific arguments. In 1616, all Copernican writings were censored. Galileo was thus forbidden to teach or otherwise disseminate the heliocentric view of the world. He then temporarily turned away from his studies and began to work on a method for measuring the oceans. In 1624, however, Galileo returned to his scientific origins as he worked until 1630 on a writing he published under the title Dialogo, in German, Dialogue on the Tides. The work incorporated the Copernican doctrine as a scientific argument and again brought him into conflict with the Church. Galileo was summoned to Rome and accused of heresy. In 1633, he was sentenced to lifelong house arrest for his scientific teachings. He was also ordered to burn his Dialogo. Galileo spent the rest of his life in his country estate outside Florence, where, despite his blindness, he worked on his last work, Discorsi e Dimostrazioni Matematiche, until 1638. In the year of publication, he obtained a partial relaxation of his imprisonment, which allowed him to stay in Florence occasionally. On the 8th of January 1642, Galileo died at his Arceti estate and was buried in an anonymous grave in Florence. It was not until 30 years after his death that an inscription was added to his final resting place. Private life. Galileo Galilei was involved with Marina Gamba during his time in Padua but never married. His relationship with Marina Gamba, about whose life little is known, produced 2 daughters, Virginia and Livia, and a son, Vincenzo. He had a close relationship with his daughter Virginia, as she took care of him sacrificially at the time of the trial and his imprisonment. She died before her father in 1634, shortly before Galileo went blind. For the scientist, the death of his daughter was the greatest blow in his life. His son Vincenzo also studied in Pisa and became a respected lute maker. The Roman Catholic Church removed the works of Copernicus and Galileo from the list of forbidden books only in 1757 and recognized their teachings. Pope John Paul II initiated a rehabilitation of the scholars in 1992 and publicly admitted the Church's error. With his findings, Galileo Galilei opened up a completely new perspective of the universe during his lifetime, which freed itself from the dogmas of the Roman Catholic Church and was based purely on scientific facts. His lifelong conflict with Rome and the experts of his time laid the foundation for modern astronomy. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, whose full first names were actually Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus, one day after his birth, was a musician and composer of the Viennese classical period. His task was, as with other composers, to shape musical culture in a progressive way and to spread it to the world and the future. Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, whose first name was actually Jakob Ludwig Felix Mendelssohn, was a composer, pianist, and organist whose task was equally valued as that of Mozart and some others. This fact also gave rise to an understanding of the classical era of music. With regard to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, their entire evolutionary or progressive work relates to the general and very important influences of music on human beings, whereby the musical stimulation, impact, and the scope of the effectiveness of the influence of music on human beings in relation to their forms of morality, ethos, ethics, and manners, and thus, of course, on their behavior, their lives, their shaping of life, and their conduct of life are of immense importance. What Faust taught with regard to the importance of music was that the might of sound or music and its effect on human beings affects their whole life and is therefore also of great importance for their general development and education. Music has a very special effect on human beings, for the might of its tones sends out an invisible, vibratory energy and great power, which, among other effects, makes human beings who are even somewhat balanced elated, happy, peaceful, joyful, psychically comfortable, but also melancholy, sad, thoughtful, and inventive, etc., which they are also able to do. Music is able to make people feel happy, peaceful, cheerful, psychically comfortable, but also melancholic, sad, thoughtful, and inventive, etc., which they also consciously perceive and which also influences their consciousness, thoughts, feelings, psychic world accordingly. Furthermore, music also creates harmonious connections with fellow human beings, with nature, its fauna and flora, just as a harmonious state with creation, universal consciousness, or with the universe itself normally results. Human beings, however, who are averse to music and their own harmonious singing, feel very little, if anything, of all these harmonious values, which also promote personal inner peace and harmony. As a rule, such human beings are either pathologically disturbed and pitiable persons, or crassly selfish, misanthropic, petty, delusionally self-centered and self-important, indecent, self-important individuals who think big and are hostile to correctness. If the origin of music is sought, then it is to be found in the creation of universal consciousness or in the universe itself, which emits an intrinsic sound event from the ground up, which is based on swinging waves that have existed fundamentally since the origin of the universe, emanate from it, and can even be scientifically proven and measured in terms of sound, etc. These swinging waves emanate from the universe or from the universe itself. These basic tones arising from the universe or from the creation of universal consciousness itself are the actual origin of all forms that have arisen in the course of time in nature, which appear as tones and can be described as nature music. Very early on, human beings began to imitate many of these tones and made primitive songs out of them, just as they gradually made musical instruments out of the most primitive means. First of all, in order to produce some kind of rhythmic sounds, as in the form of clapping their hands, but also by tapping stones, bones, and pieces of wood, etc., against each other. So it is no wonder or coincidence that music is an inseparable part of being human, like eating or sleeping. Music has existed since prehistoric times, ever since the universe, or rather creation, has had universal consciousness and emitted its own sound event. And it is also a fact that the Stone Age human ancestors made music with the help of the simplest instruments, as well as that music played an important role in every epoch of human history. Already through the human ancestors, a beat or basic pulse was created in relation to music, which was already the case with the primeval songs in the music of the still primitive first human beings, and which led to continuous, uniform musical impulses from which harmonious rhythms developed in the course of time. The more balanced the human being is in terms of consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche, mind, reason in relation to the constitution and positivity of morality, ethos, ethics, and custom, the more harmonious the musical rhythm must be for him. This is because in human beings who are negative and unbalanced in terms of the constitution of morals, ethics and morality, disharmonious tones and sounds have detrimental, inhibiting effects. I have found that everything about morality, ethics and morality has a highly pejorative effect on the values of interpersonal relationships, general self-responsibility, external responsibility, and behavior. This, while everything that is good, positive, and correct in life is rotting in the abyss of indifference and oblivion. From the harmonious music, which unfortunately since about the 1980s has been polluted by an ever-increasing disharmonious ruckus, making human beings more and more indifferent, negative, and unbalanced in terms of consciousness, feeling, psyche, mind, reason, and with regard to a healthy constitution of morals, ethos, ethics, and morality, also result in principle the creational natural laws and recommendations. These connect the human being with the universe itself, which is, after all, the actual creative power and precisely the creation of universal consciousness and thus the creation of all fine and coarse matter things and of all life, in a particularly consciousness, thought, feeling, psychological way. Effectively harmonious music also promotes social cohesion and is able to charge the human consciousness and thus also the thought-feeling psychic world with a valuable energy and power. Therefore, for every human being who is receptive to musical harmony, a life without music is simply unthinkable and detrimental to health, while on the other hand it is recognizable as a fact that those human beings who are addicted to disharmonic ruckus, which is confusedly and erroneously called music, are damaged in terms of consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche, reason, and show tremendous deficiencies with regard to a healthy constitution of morals, ethos, ethics, and morality. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was a herbalist and in this form a healer, but also an itinerant preacher, who was wrongly called an itinerant preacher, which has survived to the present day. As a herbalist who was disregarded by the medical profession and the population of the time, Rasputin was summoned to the Tsar's court in the hope of stopping the bleeding of the Tsar's son and Tsarevich Alexei, who was suffering from hemophilia, by means of herbal mixtures, which, however, was falsely and misleadingly described by so-called contemporary witnesses as prayers, because in his treatment he taught the young Tsarevich Alexei the form of self-mastery and self-influence, through the self-prayer form of self-address. Through the power of my consciousness, I alone, with my mind and with my reason, exercise omnipotence over my knowledge, truth, ability, love, and truthfulness. My might alone spreads within me, but no other if I am always aware of my own thoughts and feelings and unfold and use my knowledge, my wisdom, and my ability, and thus lead everything to true love, freedom, harmony, and peace within me. The power of my consciousness is a determination for me, so I use it for my own good, for my thoughts and feelings and psyche as well as for my body. Daily I unfold and use my power of consciousness, so that it constantly works in me and lets me meet my ignorance, whereby I nourish my knowledge and wisdom with love, compassion as well as with understanding and reason. Through the power of my consciousness, I recognize my own mistakes and correct them and avoid committing new ones, so that none can hinder me in my development and progress. The power of my consciousness lets me recognize false teachings, wrong ways of thinking, and all dangers of faith addiction, as well as of harmful material and worldly things, and avoid them. Through my power of consciousness, I am powerful even of my mind and reason. And through the omnipotence of my consciousness, I am always aware of my power, ability, peace, and knowledge, as well as my wisdom, love, and harmony, and I control everything. It was a fact that the successful work of Rasputin, whose task it was to instruct the people through his work as a herbalist, healer, and herald, with the young Tsarevich Alexei, was also confirmed by contemporary witnesses, as also confirmed by doctors and critics. Among others, that Rasputin had an extraordinarily great influence on the Tsarevich at that time, and that he also had an inexplicable positive effect on his life-threatening hemorrhages. And now as to the further part of question 11. From this derives the question, whether these shortened afterlife stays are related to the effects of overpopulation that began 300 years ago, disruption of rebirth cycles, or whether the duration of the afterlife stays is generally shorter in comparison with the lifetimes, the higher the consciousness and spiritual powers of a human being have grown, or whether this is related to the termination itself and or the acceleration of scientific etc. development influenced by the Playaran development of the internet etc. In view of the launch of the mission from 1975 onwards, the following explanation can be given. Answer: the reason lay solely in the work of the plane Arahat Atharsata, which was determinate for the preparation, and this in connection with the rapid development in every respect among earthly humanity. Therefore, at certain times in the history of earthly human development, incisive and even serious developmental processes had to appear, through which the general and very rapid process of development in all fields of progress could be guaranteed. This was made possible by the fact that at designated times a person capable of the cause had to appear in each case in order to promote the necessary of the predetermined progress. This was also controlled in this way by the level Arahat Atharsata with other persons, as a result of which also well-known scientists, after their death, reappeared as new personalities through shortened stays in the hereafter, outside the normal relationship naturally given on Earth. And as for the question, possibly another person, this is indeed the case, but it should not be discussed.
Question 12. It is predicted that in the year 3999, the human being who is then the bearer of the Nokodemion spirit form will leave the earth, accompanied by at least some of his faithful. And of course, his spirit form will then be reborn on the world on which he dies. It's to be assumed that also there, and later in the same framework, again and again elsewhere, the mission will continue in the usual framework. That is, that there will be repeated missions as a universal founder. At best also again in the sequence of 7 persons, that is to say a series of sieves as we know it from Enoch.
Answer: in the year 3999 all the spirit forms of all the members or faithful of the mission, who have worked in it and have worked themselves up into the evolutionary level set by the level Arahat Atharsata, will leave the earth and reincarnate in new personalities in a higher evolutionary humanity of another world. These new personalities will continue their evolutionary path as wise human beings, whose spirit forms will one day, according to the creative law of evolution, enter the High Council level and then the Arahat Atharsata level. According to the Arahat Atharsata level, the Nokodemion spirit form is also placed in the time of the year 3999, but not in the same way as the members of the mission, whose spirit forms will leave the earth at this distant time and reincarnate on another world. With regard to the Nokodemion spirit form, it is established that in the year 3999 it will leave the material body of the personality then existing, which at that time will carry within it the Nokodemion spirit form. This means that after the death of the personality then carrying the Nokodemion spirit form, it will not reincarnate again. Nor will a new personality be born, because the spirit form will return to the plane of Arahat Atharsata, and from there, in the course of billions of years, develop into the higher spirit energy planes. The lineage of 7 prophets is not given predetermined by creative law, for what has resulted in this respect with Nokodemion and his prophetic heraldic successor personalities was a fact that had to do primarily with his degenerated peoples and their most distant descendants, of whom various peoples exist on Earth today and are still, after billions milliards of years, of the same degenerate mind as their earliest ancestors whom Nokodemion had taken under his wing. On the other hand, the lineage of 7 prophets was only made possible by the working of the Arahat Atharsata plane. Hence it was not a rule but a one-time affair created by impulse by the high spirit energy plane Arahat Atharsata.
Question 13. Until the time has come, from now until about 1980 years from now, those human beings who are carriers of the Nokodemion spirit form will probably still make many valuable contributions to the cultural and consciousness-related, etc. development of humanity. The effects of the persons listed in question 11 will probably continue to make many valuable contributions to the cultural and consciousness development of humanity. Most probably they will continue to be active and work after relatively short interruptions in their stay in the hereafter. And possibly these human beings will also come into contact with the Figu on various occasions. Can it be assumed that in such a case, the carrier of the Nokodemion spirit form in question will make himself known to the Figu in a way that does not allow for deception after all? It is to be expected that freeloading swindlers will make their appearance, as in the case of the various fraudulent or delusional Jesus Christ revenants, etc.
Answer. Through the level Arahat Atharsata, it was foreseen that under certain circumstances the spirit form of Nokodemion would appear again in the future through a new successor personality, but not as a prophet annunciator but in a different function. In the future, the learners of the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, should have the opportunity to recognize this successor personality of the 7-fold Nokodemion Prophet-Conjurer lineage. However, these certain circumstances have not been fulfilled in the time given by the level Arahat Atharsata. Consequently, the whole of the succession personality appearing in a different capacity, which was to be born at an unspecified time between the years 2050 to 2075, has not been fulfilled. It was foreseen that the new personality would become recognizable as a bearer of the Nokodemion spirit form when the circumstances had been fulfilled, which related to a certain high value of Earth human evolution with regard to morals, ethos, ethics and manners and the values and behavior that emerge from this externally. If this evolution had found its beginning by the beginning of the new 3rd millennium in the first important outlines concerning worldwide efforts for peace, freedom and justice, which, however, had not been achieved, then the aforementioned was revoked as unrealizable and put out of force. It was explained that all that had been distributed in written form to renowned media and governments worldwide since the 1940s had not brought any success, but had been ignored by all those responsible on Earth, and consequently not one iota of all predictions had been used to bring about a change for the better. The conclusion of all this is that in the future new personalities will appear who will be born as new Nokodemion spirit form carriers, but will remain unrecognized and will also no longer be active in announcing the future. Consequently, it is also absolutely impossible that if free riders appear and are therefore imposter persons, they can be animated by the Nokodemion spirit form. If, However, it should nevertheless happen in the future that human beings should allow themselves to appear as free riders, as Nokodemion spirit form bearers and successor prophets, and in this way reveal themselves as prophets and heralds of the teaching of truth. Teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, then it is clear from the outset that they are impostors and absolutely lying false teachings. This time's bringing of teachings in the last century of the second millennium and at the beginning of the first century of the third millennium, according to the calendar since the ministry of Emmanuel, is and remains the very last in the sevenfold Nokodemion lineage. This teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life of the Nokodemion will also not be followed by any new, further or supplementary teaching, according to which this teaching will effectively only continue to exist according to what was brought in the seventh line of the prophet causation up to the first time of the third millennium in terms of teaching and actually spread worldwide in an oral and written manner through the immeasurable assistance of all members of the core group and passive group of the Figu. And finally, it is still to be explained that, on the one hand, the further new successors from the last Nokodemion lineage will remain aware of all their missionary knowledge until the time of finding their way back to the plane, Arahat Atharsata, in the year 3999. It has been envisaged that the successor personalities who will continue to retain all their missionary knowledge in relation to the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, will, however, no longer be openly prophetic announcing, but will only be active in other ways unrecognized and in the background as personalities originating from the Nokodemion lineage. So it will also not be that they will come out as such in Figu circles, absolutely never. Consequently, it can be absolutely ruled out in any way that any free riders can ever appear, because such can be ruled out 100% as successor personalities throughout. The subsequent new personalities from the Nokodemion spirit form lineage will continue to remain on Earth after the completion and termination of the sevenfold Nokodemion lineage mission. But they will leave it temporarily because these personalities will also continue to be in contact with the Playaran. And this will also be the case when the Playaran finally return to their space-time dimension in 2029 and will no longer have any effect on Earth in any way.
Question 14 during all the coming years in which the universe is still expanding. That is, during another 109.5 trillion years. How long will the Nokodemion's heralding mission continue? Is there any predetermination in this regard on the part of the Arahat Atharsata plane, or in any other form? The past 9.6 billion years are only a short moment compared to the rest of the immensely long duration of existence of the universe. To put it colloquially, when or under what conditions and circumstances will the Nokodemion spirit form one day make its more than deserved final retirement from the material world?
Answer. This question was previously answered in a clarifying manner with the answer to question 13.
Question 15. What about the extension of the mission time of those faithful whose further evolution into the half-spirit plane High Council has been slowed down or influenced by the spirit plane Arahat Atharsata to such an extent that they can now support the Universal Founder in the mission far longer than the standard duration of 40 to 60 million years in the material world? Is their future duration of action synchronized with that of the Universal Covenanter, or does it end at an earlier time, at which point new faithful are found and committed die? They commit themselves, of course.
Answer. From the year 3999, when the spirit forms of the members or faithful of the mission migrate to another higher evolutionary world and to its humanity, the continuation of the standard duration of 40 to 60 million years in the material world begins, which means that the further time will be counted from that which is then authoritative through the present evolutionary state of the spirit forms and personalities concerned. The lengthening of the missionary period is therefore not a disadvantage, but an advantage, because evolution will result in great progress. New members or faithful with regard to the continuation of the mission will no longer appear, because from the year 3999, as is determined by the level Arahat Atharsata, humanity on Earth must continue to develop independently in every respect according to the teaching of truth. Teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, or perish.
Question 16. Since every spirit form of every human being will one day have entered the spirit plane, Patali, when the universe reaches the end of its expansion and begins to contract. The process of recreation of human beings on planets will probably run out quite a bit earlier, but in any case, in time. Is it known when in the next 109.6 trillion years it will be? Considering that it took 46 trillion years for the first human beings to emerge, it can be assumed that the phase after the disappearance of the last human being from the material world and until the universe falls back will also encompass many trillions of years. Are you aware of the corresponding figure?
Answer. The first human beings and innumerable different life forms did not come into being after 46 trillion years, but already after the first matter belt had come into full function. So it corresponds to a misunderstanding? Probably also because the whole thing in this respect has never come up for discussion and answer in an explanatory way. But if we must now speak of it, in order to eliminate the misunderstanding, then it must be explained that the only after 46 trillion years did the first human beings come into being must be understood in a different way than this was unfortunately erroneously understood due to a lack of necessary explanations. The missing explanation is that in the present matter belt and thus only after 46 trillion years after the formation of the universe and the first formation of the matter belt or of the material universe in today's matter belt, the first human beings came into being again in today's matter belt through the process of development in the Dern universe. So the whole thing refers only to the time of the now 17 billion old new matter belt, which after the transitionless renewal is now only 17 billion years old and in which the first, but repeated life arose after 46 trillion years. In the creation of universal consciousness, that is to say in the Dern universe, which has an age of about 46 trillion years, the first matter belt already developed in the first existence, in which the first life forms and thus also human beings etc. already developed and everything began to evolve. Since then, the matter belts have completely renewed themselves almost 1,000 times without transition over the 46 trillion years that have passed so far, which was the case for the last time about 17 billion years ago. As a result of which the present material universe or the matter belt has now existed for 17 billion years after the last complete and transitionless renewal. And in this Dern universe matter belt, after 46 trillion years since the origin of the universe in the completely renewed Dern universe matter belt, new life forms of all genera and species and consequently also human forms have developed again for the first time. So the whole thing about the first human beings only developed after 46 trillion years does not refer to the fact that the first human beings only developed after 46 trillion years after the formation of the universe. But the opinion is that after 46 trillion years, during which human beings and countless other life forms always existed in all the individual renewed matter belts, new life forms of all kinds and species had also developed in the matter belt, which had been renewed for about the 1,000th time without transition, and now existed for 17 billion years, including human beings. This, while already about 46 trillion years ago in the very first matter belt after the creation of universal consciousness or the universe, human beings, human-like beings, and innumerable other life forms of various kinds and species developed and evolved. And when the matter belt renewed itself without transition about 17 billion years ago, no more life forms existed before that, so also no human beings, because in the course of each of the last 3 billion years of the matter belt renewing itself without transition, it results that all life forms reach their highest stage of development and their spirit forms pass into higher spirit levels. As a result, the matter belt is then free and untouched by all material life forms, after which, already after the complete renewal of the matter belt within a few billion years, new life forms of all genera and species emerge from the planets and their waters, etc. Also human beings and human-like beings, etc., which in the course of time evolve again, change into higher life forms and follow the normal path of development. As there is universal consciousness in all of creation, every life form has actual and dormant phases of life, or its waking and sleeping rhythms. And this is so from the tiniest bacterium to the largest and most gigantic living being. In this way is also to be understood the becoming and passing away, which reaches from the tiniest to the most violent, whereby the creation of universal consciousness or the universe is meant. This, too, and everything contained in it, is in every respect classified in the order of the phase of activity and rest, which is also connected with a constant change of passing away and becoming again, as also exists and can be perceived in free nature on planet Earth. With this, it can also be explained that also in the universal matter belt, which is mistakenly misunderstood by Earth humans as the entire universe, there is an active and a resting phase during its transitionless renewal, which, however, forms itself in such a way that after the completed renewal, a time of fallow takes place, which lasts 3 billion years, during which no more life forms exist, but such only develop again after this time. These are my most important questions, the answers to which are probably very valuable for the human beings of today, but especially for those in the future. Thank you, best regards, and Salome Christian Frainer, 28.1. 2018.
English translation, 704th Contact Part 3, Thursday the 1st of March 2018, 21:54 hours.
As you wish. But on the other hand, the whole thing is not of importance for mission work and mission learning, which is why you should not go further into such questions, which also keep you from your actual important work, whereby it is also to be said that there can be no question of importance regarding such questions.
You have already said that, and so shall it be in future.
Then I want to say about your article from the 14th of January, which Njana photographed and gave to me to read, that I have read it and found it to be correct, elaborative, and good, and also presents the facts correctly.
Thanks. I will add it to our conversation right here then, which I do not think needs any further explanation.
Threat of war escalation by the USA and EU dictatorship.
The war-threatening situation on Earth is escalating ever more, for it becomes quite evident that Western hatred, especially that of the USA and the EU dictatorship of Russia, is intensifying, which may indicate that a war or something destructive is being prepared against Russia. This is also demonstrated by the encirclement of Russia with Western military bases, with NATO also getting involved, which is increasingly penetrating into the East and thus into Russia. And the fact that this is the case is clearly demonstrated by the USA with its missile defense shield against Russia, as has also been and is proven by Western operations in Ukraine. And if this is carried on in this way, it can lead to a new, serious, and fourth world war, which will then be total. And this danger already exists through the warmongering machinations of the USA and the EU dictatorship. Although China would then also be included in such a fourth world war because the USA also flirts with it in relation to world domination. However, if this madness becomes a reality that the USA, in its megalomania, reaches for Russia and possibly also China, then Russia and China, like the USA, will defend themselves with nuclear weapons. And if the megalomania and world domination of the USA forces Russia and China into such a war, then it will be so violent that there are no more winners and nothing will remain. For this reason, there can only be one slogan for all forces for peace. It means that the folk of the United States of America and the EU dictatorship must say no to their power-obsessed and warmongering rulers and remove them from office. The USA and the EU dictatorship must abandon their insanity to bring other states under their control and into bondage, strife, and lack of justice. The USA in particular is effectively running in world imperial structures of war and destruction, whereby the EU dictatorship also shows similar airs and graces, as well as NATO, which is constantly striving to expand its power, but in this respect, the state powers of Germany are not lagging behind and show similar ambitions. Now, it is imperative that a worldwide appeal be initiated and addressed to the humanity on Earth, whether it wants peace or war, as well as justice, freedom or injustice and lack of freedom. First and foremost, however, it must be borne in mind that if peace, freedom and justice are really to be achieved, all warmongers in the states concerned must first and foremost be removed from their government, military and secret service offices, and so on. In this regard, there is an urgent need for the populations of all countries that fall under the category of countries of warmongering and world domination to do everything required and necessary in order to appoint the right, good and capable people, who are oriented towards the well-being of the peoples and of all mankind on earth, as ruling state authorities. The peoples of such states themselves decide in full conscious certainty for peace, freedom and justice, without any form of conviction, but in certainty of reality and its truth, because a conviction corresponds in every case to a suggestive persuasion or influence, manipulation and seduction. Consequently, the folk alone must bear responsibility for ensuring that all government leaders who are warmongering, selfish, desperate for power, and addicted to power are no longer allowed to have power, but only the majority of the entire folk, and in any case only in accordance with the will of the folk. Only in this way can an effective and true democracy be and prevail, in which not the rulers, but the majority of the folk decide for peace, freedom and justice, and determine everything. Although it must also be clear that religion and sectarianism have nothing to do with this, and that in this respect no state-induced demands and connections must neither be nor exist. And since a people is made up of a large number of people who, of course, are not all of the same views and interests, there must be, on the one hand, a fair electoral system through which a majority of voters can support or reject an electoral objective. On the other hand, there is an inevitable need for an absolutely detailed, correct and clear statement to the electorate on the positive and negative effects of the electoral objectives, so that the electorate can understand the situation and weigh the pros and cons against each other. Only in this way can and must a true democracy be understood, because only in this way does it mean a real rule of the common people. There must be no unlimited power, and no abuse of power to the detriment of the people to rulers, the military, secret services, and organizations linked to or aligned with these. But the people or peoples themselves must be given power for security, peace, freedom, justice, and democracy in the form of majority decisions. Only in this way can everything in a state function properly, peacefully, liberally and justly, and in fact also outwardly, to all other countries peace, freedom and justice be preserved and maintained and reign permanently. This also includes the separation of powers, fundamental rights, human rights and freedom of expression, as well as freedom, equality and fraternity, whereby fraternity must in principle mean both sexes, that is to say woman and man. However, some of the terms mentioned require some explanation, so some of these values need to be explained. Safe, freedom of faith, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of philosophy and freedom of belief, as well as freedom of politics, etc. are also included, but this does not require any special explanations. 1. Separation of powers is an alternative or technical term in relation to the actual government, which acts as head of state, president, minister, secretary of state, etc., which also includes the administration, that is to say all the authorities and offices, etc., which have to implement all decisions taken. Together, the gubernative and the administrative form the executive branch. The separation of powers ensures that the power of the state is distributed among several state bodies, for the purpose of limiting the power of one state body, that such a power cannot possess and apply unrestricted power, but also that freedom, equality, and fraternity are guaranteed. In Switzerland, power is in the hands of three different authorities or state bodies with regard to the separation of powers. One is the legislature or legislative power, then the executive branch has executive power, and the judiciary has jurisdiction. On the one hand, the legislature and thus legislative and thus legal and respectively legislation and respectively law exerts its power. On the other hand, the executive and executing, respectively, executive and public security and order exercising power, and the third is the judicial and judicially exercising power. However, it must be understood that the term Gewalt does not mean any criminal acts, but the application of the laws and rights of a state and the righteous means determined by the people to enforce these laws and rights. State authority refers to the exercise of sovereign power within a country's territory by its bodies elected by the people. Corresponding institutions, such as the head of state, government and administration, as well as the army and police, parliament and courts. In a separate and regulatory form, the executive is the power to govern, with the legislature being the legislative power controlled by the government, while the judiciary controls the government and the legislature. The executive, legislative and judicial branches are strictly separated. That is the real principle of the separation of powers, which corresponds to a fundamental principle of democracy, but which is not fully present in any state throughout the world. A semi-democracy prevails only in Switzerland, while all other earthly states have no real democracy, but only claim, contrary to all truth, that they are democratic, with the republics in particular on the front line with such false claims in this respect. In fact, in the case of the republics, the peoples have practically only a right to determine the election of their state leaders, but not their actions and the actual state leadership and state actions, which means that the state leaders arbitrarily determine and act above the heads of the population. In Switzerland, the separation of powers was introduced in the Federal Constitution of 1848, whereby this separation of powers prevented the concentration of power of individual persons or institutions and put a stop to the abuse of power, which is further guaranteed by the fact that a person belonging to a state authority may only belong to one of the three state authorities at a time. 2. Freedom and fraternity. These terms are actually borrowed from a motto and correspond to a French slogan of the French Republic and the Republic of Haiti, but the whole thing is known as a libet, egalites, fraternito, and is based on the slogans of the French Revolution of 1789, which, however, can be bound in an expanded and somewhat altered Swiss sense to the Rutlischwur of the first three Swiss citizens Werner Stauffacher von Schwyz, Walter Fürst von Uwe, and Arnold von Melchthal unter Walden. In this respect, the words of Friedrich Schiller, which he wrote for the drama The Wilhelm Tell, come into their own. Schiller, whose full first name was Johann Christoph Friedrich, was born on the 10th of November, 1759 in Marbach am Neckar, Germany, and died in Weimar on the 9th of May, 1805. In 1802 he was ennobled, and in addition, he was a doctor, poet and philosopher, but also a historian and is regarded as one of the most important German playwrights, lyricists and essayists. The dazzling drama of William Tell refers to August 1291 as Switzerland's national holiday, and thus to the legend of the Rutlischwars of the Old Swiss against Habsburg. At that time, 3 brave men from Ui, Schwyz, and Unterwalden were said to have been the first Swiss to gather on the Rutli and conspire for freedom and independence. 3. The idea of establishing 1291 as the year in which the Swiss Confederation was founded and the 1st of August as the Swiss federal holiday dates back to the initiative of the people of Bern. According to legend, the Swiss Federal Charter was concluded at the beginning of August 1291, for which Schiller coined the following words for the Rutlish Oath: "We want to be a single folk of brethren, never to part in danger nor distress. We want to be free, as our fathers were, and rather die than live in slavery. We want to trust in the one highest God, and never be afraid of human power." For equality must be interpreted somewhat above all in a political and philosophical context, so that a correspondence of a number of things, persons, facts in a particular characteristic in the case of differences, exists in other characteristics, including in relation to human rights and peoples before the laws, etc. In this sense, it is also to be understood that an equality between 2 or more objects and 1 or more properties, also with regard to the laws, the state, and each individual citizen. Equality also refers to the relationship between objects or persons to be compared, such as equality with regard to quality, quantity, or of the relation, which is determined by the method of comparison. If equality is related to man, then it embodies a general ideal of justice, which in the earthly history of mankind and its development already effectively goes back over 2,000 years. Besides freedom and fraternity, equality must be a fundamental democratic principle that all men must be equal before the law. 5. Fundamental rights. Human rights and freedom of expression allow everyone to freely exercise their individual religious convictions in the form of religion, politics, or ideology, which, in addition to belonging to a religious or ideological community, also includes cultic activity. 6. Democracy. It can actually still be explained that the ancient democracies in Greece and the Roman Empire, which emanated from Athens and Rome, were the real forerunners of today's so-called democracies and were orientated toward reaction to the too great a might of the rulers. But it was only after the Enlightenment, in the 17th and 18th centuries, that philosophers formulated essential elements of the modern democracy, after which the values and forms that promote peace, freedom, justice, and popular participation were gradually included as important components in this concept of a democracy. 7. Faith. Freedom of faith, freedom of religion, and freedom of philosophy correspond to a naturally predetermined right of man and guarantee him, in relation to a religion, sect as well as philosophy, etc., to freely exercise and represent a faith of any kind, insofar as the whole of the right is and does not in any way conflict with human moral, human and physical health, generally life and state security conditioned as well as state prescribed right and law, but is legally just, juristically legal or legitimate, regular, permissible, and thus constitutionally unobjectionable, allowed and acceptable in any form of what is permitted. This must be so according to man's freedom of his own will and the resulting self-decision, whereby he can believe something unprovable or reject it according to intellect and rationality or fathom the effective truth. Effectively, however, a religious sectarian faith can never be proven to be correct, because it is based on a fixed and imaginative idea that usually arises from a conviction. 8. Religion, sectarianism, beliefs, philosophy, ideology, and state. Nothing can be objected to faith, freedom of religion, freedom of philosophy, and any ideology, for all this corresponds to the right of every individual. But the whole in relation to faith, freedom of philosophy, and any ideology may not be determined, directed, exploited financially or otherwise, and taxed by the state. This means that every religion, sect, every faith, every philosophy and ideology in absolutely every respect must exist and must exist independently of the state, so consequently, a separation of religion, faith, philosophy and ideology must be given. If the Christian religion is taken as a starting point in this respect, then this means that there must be a separation of church and state, which also applies to all other religions and their soul launching pads. The state must therefore have no right. For the Christian churches, from their believers and from legal persons, and so on. To raise taxes in order to finance the churches, their operation and maintenance, and to remunerate the priests. It must be right that the state keeps itself free in this respect as well as from the remuneration of preachers, priests, cardinals, bishops, pope and clergymen. With regard to state and religion, etc., the false state religion constitutional law existing in various states, in Christianity state church law, machinations and models with regard to tax claims by the state, are a farce. To pay taxes for a cause of deceit and deception, for a religion, sects, a confused faith, a philosophy and ideology, that is probably more than just criminal. Some man, his religious, sectarian, philosophical belief or other confused ideology is considered important and a guideline for his life and behavior, even if hardly any believer sees this as such and lives by it. But tangled himself in his own deceit and in his self-deception, because in his faith he leads far away from all reality and its effective truth as well as his life. This makes the whole outlook and faith behavior of man in relation to reality and its irrefutable truth roaringly ridiculous. And for this ridiculousness, the followers of faith, sects, religion, philosophy and ideology pay state taxes if everything is legitimate under state constitutional law with regard to institutions, religious communities, sectarianism, philosophies and ideologies under state tax law. But the opposite must be the case, because it is only in this way correct and right, that only the faithful or members of an institution, such as religion, sect, philosophy or ideology of any kind, have to pay their mite to their institution or organization, etc., which must never be done by the participation of the state. Dasung. A religion, sect, philosophy or ideology must never be of a state nature, according to which a state must also have no right to levy taxes on such institutions from the faithful or legal persons. Every religion, sect, philosophy, ideology and thus also every religious community, as well as every legal person and every knowledge community of any kind must be organizationally separated from the state by state laws. Just as everything that is mentally cultivated and represented by people must be free of state taxes. 9. Belief is based on a factor of self-suggestion or self-created self-suggestive imagination and thus on a resulting delusion. A belief is in any case a factor of a suggestive faith which comes about through fear, false gratitude or confused hope etc. Belief always takes place in such a way that someone influences another person or he influences himself for some unrealistic reason, religiously, sectarian or in some form of another opinion, assertion or thing etc. suggestively. This creates a firm and unshakable faith in a suggestive object that mocks every real experience. Every belief is based on a foreign or one's own suggestively generated opinion, imagination and thus on a delusion, which is as foreign to every reality and its truth as every conscious malicious lie is to the effective, experienceable and tangible reality. This is because a belief corresponds in every case to a suggestive persuasion or influencing, manipulation and seduction. A belief creates in humans, through suggestive acting fellow human beings, speeches, events, situations, religions or sectarianism and all kinds of occurrences etc. or through confused self-suggestion, a new opinion and thus an imagination, a delusion and a faith. and this is fixed in his consciousness, in his thoughts, and in the feelings arising from them. In this way, the whole is conceived as a faith beyond the intellect and reason of man, following which a suggestively conditioned belief is evoked in him that is far removed from all reality and truth. This also happens through an appropriate self-suggestive way, when man convinces himself or suggestively creates a faith for himself and thus falls into imagination and a delusion that is unrealistic and untruthful, and in this way ignores his intellect and his reason as well as the certainty of truth. 10. Certainty and uncertainty. Certainty corresponds to the effective form of reality, that is to say reality and its truth, whereby any conceivable form of belief is nothing other than an uncertainty that completely contradicts reality, that is to say reality and its truth. Certainty is a firm, unshakable knowledge, statement and opinion gained by consciously examining a fact and by experiencing and being experienced. Thus only the clear and real certainty proves to be correct in every respect, because it is not the uncertainty and belief, but exclusively the certainty results in the effective, recognizable and comprehensible real proofs and facts in relation to the factuality of reality, that is to say reality and its irrefutable truth, which is absolutely unshakable until the distant future. So that is what had to be explained in this respect, but all this led away from all that I want to say about the agitated warmongering, criminal intrigues and criminal machinations of US-American political and military machinations that have been stirring up the whole world since time immemorial. Indeed, the fact that since the US-America has existed, the United States of America has always and almost exclusively been at the forefront, and can be mentioned in this regard, in terms of warmongering and world domination as well as malicious Secret Service actions and warfare with inhuman war crimes all over the world. Already in the early days of the USA, many of the immigrated new population and their descendants, mainly from all over Europe and Asia, including many sectarians, criminals, and outlaws, many of whom were expelled or fled from their home countries, harassed, murdered, and robbed the natives of their land. And this happened not only by the farmers, ranchers, cattle barons, criminals and outlaws, and other land thieves, but especially under the leadership of the power-addicted, belligerent elites of the former government and the military and secret services, who were eager to rob the natives and the Indians of their traditional territories and homeland through bloody wars and tens of thousands of murder massacres. Yes, the natives of America were removed, murdered and slaughtered by war massacres by immigrants from all over Europe, mainly from all over Europe, from their homelands, taking away not only their homeland but also all their strength and power to continue to exist independently. Well, it has also been a fact since time immemorial, and this has remained unbroken to this day, that the boundless obsession with power, the falseness, underhandedness and the greed for world food in the USA continue to scare and frighten the populations of many countries around the world from underhand US Secret Service or US warlike machinations. And all these people will continue to live into the future with the uncertainty of a possible further and globally destructive world war with nuclear weapons brought about by the USA. All these folk, who live worldwide in fear of the greed for world domination, want to live in peace, freedom and justice and hope that a fair and good power will finally emerge, such as a worldwide peace-fighting force that will be able to push all the domination-addicted and power-hungry powers of the government, military and Secret Service elites of the United States of America off the pedestal of their greed for world domination. And if the earth is to become peaceful, then the people of every country must inevitably become active together with all other populations of the earth and form a peace movement in the form of a worldwide peace-fighting force through which on the one hand real peace and freedom and justice is created among all peoples and people, just as on the other hand also in every state a state leadership may only be determined by the peoples themselves and which may only act and work according to the decisions given by the peoples. For this, it is also necessary that all peoples agree to the following important prerequisites. There must be a willingness, the will and the assertiveness to maintain a lasting peace, freedom and justice in every respect. All hostilities and warlike airs and graces, ambitions, agitations, actions and deeds, etc. must be ended immediately and without ifs and buts. Every person, folk and government must immediately be concerned with lifting and ending sanctions against other persons, folks or states without delay and with working towards lasting relations in the spirit of peaceful, liberal and equitable cooperation and partnership. Any person of understanding, reason and responsibility in any state must immediately say no without any ifs and buts and refuse to act against the body, life and safety of the people, just as he must also outlaw all aggressions directed and demanded by governments, state powers, secret services and the military, etc. in hostile, unpeaceful, unfree, and unjust form against another country, its population, a group of people or against an individual person. Today, as it has been since ancient times, when people were still beating their skulls with clubs, there are still the same dangers in terms of strife, lack of freedom, injustice, war, murder, and manslaughter. So nothing has changed for the better with regard to the hostilities of men since time immemorial. On the contrary, everything has become worse and worse. 3 world wars from 1756 to 1763, 1914 to 1918, and 1939 to 1945, along with countless other weapons, wars and other murderous and massacring events and actions, have claimed hundreds of millions of lives in virtually every country on Earth over the last 13 millennia. And even today there is still no end to this madness, or even an estimate of its effects, for there is always a new danger looming of world war. Again, in all countries of the world, insane thinking and behavior are being used to upgrade weapons of war, and madness has never been so degenerate as it is today with threats regarding the use of nuclear weapons and even worse. Especially, as has been the case since time immemorial, the US is in first place with such threats, but so is North Korea, where both states are ruled by apparent lunatics, the US by a stupid trample trumpeter named Trump, and North Korea by a lunatic, stupid, brainless, fratricidal and kinship murderer named Kim Jong-un. But that's not all, because all of the world's state-governing madmen who are building their countries into weapons-bursting destruction depots live in the madness of the idea that they would have to create a weapons balance against the other and hostile countries with a tremendously deadly and all-destroying weapons collection hodgepodge. And so, they believe in their delusion, they could instill fear and terror into the enemy and prevent an attack on their country and a war from breaking out. In this way, a completely erroneous and insane arsenal balance of weapons is completely stupidly assumed to prevent an attack by the enemy and a war. But today's war-threatening situation continues to escalate, with the great threat and warmongering emanating, as ever, from the United States of America and, how could it be otherwise, directed against Russia, which the world domination-addicted USA would love so much to incorporate as a defeated vassal state. So, after wars of aggression against Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, a war against Russia is being prepared, although the USA is also considering China, somehow secretly at the moment. The fact is that, on the one hand, the United States and, on the other hand, NATO, to which the EU dictatorship also extends its hand if possible, have the audacity to move ever more eastwards from the West in order to encircle Russia with military bases. So the construction of a US missile defense shield is being pushed ahead, just as Western operations in Ukraine are part of this increasingly precarious confrontation. Also, Hollande, the snobbish French president from 2012 to 2017, declared in February 2015 megalomaniacally, "We are at war, and this war can become total." And indeed, today there is a danger of another and fourth world war. But if the megalomaniac USA and those who attack Russia with these megalomaniacs of NATO and the EU dictatorship attack, then Russia will defend itself and let a nuclear monster break loose, which at least destroys, if not more, not only the majority of the Western Hemisphere. And if this impending disaster, which has already been conjured up and is floating like a sword of Damocles over the world, actually breaks out through the USA, NATO and EU dictatorship, through the insane madness of the Western powers, above all the USA, NATO and EU dictatorship, then what former Secretary of State Willy Wimmer said in November 2014 will happen, then it will be the case that nothing will remain of us. If all these things, factors and facts are now considered, then there is only the solution for the peoples of the USA and the EU dictatorship, as well as for NATO, to exhort themselves and finally put an end to their agitation and enmity against Russia. And for all people on Earth who want peace, freedom and justice, it should be said that there is only one solution, namely to stand up to their warmongering and belligerent governments, military and secret services, etc., and refuse to take up arms for these stupid and erroneous and power-obsessed and lame, unprincipled, non-understanding, irrational and irresponsible morons. So the only solution for the survival of mankind on Earth is that the people strictly refuse to risk their lives for their mad, power-addicted, weak and insane, warmongering state powers, military and secret services, etc., not to throw their lives away and not to go to war, in which there will be no winner, but only losers and a completely destroyed Earth. So for this reason there is only one thing for all forces of peace: freedom and justice, to say no and refuse to bow down after the will of the state powers possessed by hatred against other countries and to do their will by going to war for them. All people of all peoples of the world must step out of the control of their warmongering state powers and say goodbye to the imperial structures of war. Understanding and reason demand that the entire West, above all, the war and world domination-loving USA, but also NATO and the EU dictatorship, finally put aside their traditional cowardly fear and terror of Russia as well as their hatred of Russia. And with regard to the USA, they must finally give up their erroneous ambitions regarding the annexation of Russia or their violent attempt to take possession of Russia and, on the contrary, cooperate with Russia in a peaceful, liberal and just manner. According to statements and explanations of the Pleeron, the USA has been striving for well over 100 years to annex Russia by war and coercion and to make it a US vassal state, during which time the USA has also done and continues to do everything in its power to prevent Europe and the European states from being able to ally themselves with Russia or from being able to do so now or in the future through an alliance. However, this measure of prevention should not and must not be maintained, which is why, in Europe, intellect and rationality can still move among those who are still reasonable, unbiased and righteous, who have not yet allowed themselves to be hopelessly wrapped up in the EU dictatorship, so that the nasty ambiguities of the USA against Russia cannot be enforced, but can be wiped out. That is why all righteous people of Europe must make an effort to defend themselves against the dirty, lying and slanderous machinations and agitations of the United States against Russia in an intentional manner, even over the filthy intrigues and obstructionism of the EU dictatorship, which demonizes Russia as an enemy in a similar pattern to that of the United States. In principle, no sanctions should be imposed against Russia. Existing sanctions must be lifted and understanding and cooperation initiated for the benefit of all peoples of Europe and the whole world and maintained in peace, freedom and justice. And that Russia, in contrast to the USA and the EU dictatorship, does not incite war and hatred against the West, especially not against the USA and the EU dictatorship, but rather holds back against all dirty political attacks, lies and slander. Even a person with a weak intellect and rationality can recognize this, but not the imbeciles and power-obsessed of the EU dictatorship and the US administration, as well as its military and secret services, etc. The same applies to the rulers in Kiev in Ukraine, who came to power with the help of fascists in a coup, who show strong anti-democratic tendencies and promote Russian hatred as vehemently as the USA and the EU dictatorship do. Fundamentally, the USA and the EU dictatorship and its individual countries must establish a peaceful policy towards Russia, as well as a foreign policy in general with regard to all the countries of the world, and without any pretenses of annexation with regard to foreign countries. This also includes that all US foreign missions of the US military and US secret services will end immediately, as well as various countries must balance the EU dictatorship, which fly military forces out to foreign countries and let them intervene in their trade. All arms exports to other countries must also be banned and stopped immediately. All nuclear weapons must be destroyed and banned and ostracized from the earth, as well as all drones and other sneaky means of murder by which executions and destruction are carried out. The policy of threats and blackmail, the assassination of all kinds by secret service actions, etc., but also all economic sanctions and procedures contrary to international law, etc., must also be brought to an immediate end. Instead, all world leaders, all military and secret services, etc. must stand up for just peace, for true freedom and justice, just as all state, military and secret service crimes must be punished internationally and all international rights must be defended, enforced and observed, for which the UN must in principle be responsible in its function as a collective security system. Unfortunately, however, the political, military, secret service and economic powers are caught in the clutches of financial capital, and all of them, along with their power, are enriching themselves financially. This also follows from the fact that there is no withdrawal from the negotiations on the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement TTIP, which really only serves the purpose of strengthening the power bloc of the West or the USA and the EU dictatorship. And this is in accordance with the fact that it will allow the whole West to continue to rival Russia and China and to reconstitute everything against them. In addition to this, these roaringly power-hungry machinations of the USA and EU dictatorship also serve to prevent the sovereignty and the construction of any democratically emerging self-determination of the peoples, and to make them hopelessly dependent on the USA and the EU dictatorship with allegedly a new free dictates or effective forms of dictatorship. This is also linked to the fact that in Europe all or at least many EU dictatorship norms are suspended, which allows and enables big business to destroy the economies of other countries and make the countries themselves completely financially dependent on the EU dictatorship and their slave states and vassal states until they go bankrupt and collapse. All this is leading more and more to practically unstoppable malignant antisocial development, and to the fact that in every country of the EU dictatorship, as in the USA, only a few people are becoming rich and owning the largest percentage of the entire nation's wealth. As a result, these few are, and will become much richer in financial assets than the states themselves, which means that the money magnates and asset magnates will rise above the political, governing, military, secret services, etc. as new power elites, and will be able to put them out of power and rule the peoples and states as new elites. Simyase Silver Star Center, Sunday the 18th of February, 2018, 0:58 hours, Billy.
You can do that.
Good. Then I want to ask you now if you can give an answer as to why I had to get to the US government and not the USSR government through EL in the early 1980s to make contact with you through me as an intermediary. Because this matter was never openly explained, which is why I am also always asked why the USSR, or this instead of the USA, was not chosen by you. Of course I know the reason for this, which you have given me, but there is no open explanation for it. Especially also because you have always refrained from any contacts with the USA as a result of their world-dominating behavior, their warmongering, and their constant interference in the affairs of other countries. And it is precisely for this reason that many Earthlings do not understand why you wanted to establish contact with the rulers and the military of the USA through me as a mediator. And likewise, it is not understood why you did not want to contact USA critics directly.
I can understand these questions and explain the following. We did not consider direct contact with state officials, the U.S. intelligence services and U.S. military for various reasons, which I will explain a little. First and foremost, direct and open contact with those responsible in the United States of America was not possible because, according to our directives, such action or direct contact with Earth or with Earth governments, military and secret services and other organizations is just as forbidden as direct contact with Earth humans. The only exception was when Petra and Anatol were involved in a contact connection, who, according to your instructions, should have assisted you. This connection ended. However, after Eva had brought you to the two of them in Huningen in Alsace, where you were to discuss with them their work, which they were to have taken on, but which unfortunately did not happen, because sometime after your meeting both of them fell victim to an unforeseen fatal car accident, and the planned enterprise was thereby rendered invalid.
Note: Huningen equals French Huning, Alsatian Hinage High Alemannic, or Heinenschlo Alemannic, is a French municipality with about 7,000 inhabitants, as of March 2018, in the Haute-Rhin department in the Grand Estate region, until 2015 Alsace, and belongs to France, to the canton Saint-Louis. The neighboring French municipalities of Huningen are Saint-Louis and Village-Neuf. In Huningen, the Canal de Huning branches off from the Rhine, with the Swiss Klein Huningen, an urban outskirt of Basel, lying to the right of the Rhine. Huningen is directly adjacent to the Swiss city of Basel and the southern Baden city of Weil am Rhein in the Federal Republic of Germany, directly in the border triangle of Germany, Switzerland, France. Together with its directly adjacent neighboring town of Lorach, the whole forms a regional center.
Earth humans other than Petra and Anatol were and are not allowed according to our directives for direct contacts, nor indirect ones. This, however, if we disregard the evolutionary development impulse contacts or impulse information, which we have been radiating extensively to the whole Earth since the 16th century, and which were so directed, towards the development and progress of all very important technical apparatus and devices, and continue to be programmed in this way, that they came directly into the consciousness of earthly inventors, researchers and scientists. As a result, an extremely rapid and far-reaching technical development took place in many diverse electronic data processing areas, which would otherwise have taken a development process of well over 130 years. This, however, could not be justified, because your mission was providently based on the electronic development resulting from the evolutionary development impulses, which had to be geared towards you being able to produce, record, and disseminate your teaching work, and teaching instruction in written form in a good and preserving manner. So the bringing and spreading of the manifold and very wide-ranging teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life required a high electronic technical development, especially related to computer technology, which enabled you to do your wide-ranging works, recordings, explanations, expositions, and the written recording of the manifold teachings. Without the entire technical development of this kind, which could only come about through our efforts to transmit impulses to earthly researchers, inventors, and scientists, it would have been impossible for you to record your teaching work and mission in writing and to disseminate it worldwide in the way that it has come about. And everything had to be like this. For the whole of the teaching had on the one hand finally to be recorded well and correctly and comprehensively in the modern world, and on the other hand to be spread globally, for only in this way was there a possibility that the same unpleasant thing would not happen as in the days of the earlier heralds, who only brought the teaching orally and thus hardly achieved any success. And this led to the fact that their teachings were falsified over decades and centuries in a constantly orally handed down manner and passed on as oral traditions, after which they were later recorded in completely unrealistic and untruthful outgrowths. Distortions, false assertions, and confused interpretations as true teachings of the prophets, etc., by completely untruthful handing down memories by those who knew the scriptures. But this had to be prevented this time, which is why the necessary technical preconditions had to be created so that you could write down yourself everything that was relevant to your missionary work and record the whole thing in writing, which could only happen by enabling the necessary evolutionary impulse transmissions into the consciousness of earthly researchers, inventors, and scientists. These then developed the necessary apparatus and devices which you could use, and by recording the teaching in writing, transmit it yourself unaltered for all time. You were supposed to write 8 books for this purpose, but you exceeded this number by far, and consequently you have written a total of almost 70 instructive books. But to go on to say what arises with regard to direct and indirect contacts and connections between us and Earth humans, the only exception relates to you, for which the reasons known to you are based extensively in your mission and time-honored origin of your spirit form. Although it is possible for us to contact the earthly leaders, military and secret services, etc., indirectly through purely technical means of communication, it is really only as an alternative solution, because we can only consider a communicative technical form due to the blatant difference in vibration between us and the Earth humans, which is why we could not enter into a direct contact solution and also could not do so in the future. This in addition to other things, such as, because it is well known to us since the existence of the United States of America, that all those U.S. Americans who were in positions of power in the state leadership, the military and the secret services, etc., have always, without exception, exercised a malicious insidiousness, scheming, deceitfulness, aggressiveness, and belligerence, as well as betrayal, and have always exercised a profound desire for power, as well as a desire for domination, a breach of promise, and a desire to rule over their allies, who are always only expedient for them. And this was already the case at the earliest and most fundamental times. When George Washington, before he advanced to become the first U.S. president, had a white-flagged French negotiating troop treacherously shot dead. And because these facts are not known to today's U.S. people, but also to the majority of the Earth's population, the majority of U.S. supporters from all over the world have always been unthinkingly in favor of the state powers, military and secret services, etc. of the United States of America. However, as in all ancient times, all leaders, military, secret services, and all organizations of the USA today are equally afflicted with world power addiction. Injustice, warmongering, and unconscionability, as it was also at the time when we chose you as mediator between U.S. America and us. And that they are extremely suspicious when it comes to their alleged state security is also known to us. As is also the fact that in truth there is a profound fear of losing control over the entire U.S. population and thus also over the country itself. Especially this fear leads to a self-suggestive martial basic behavior in every single human being of the governing, military and secret services, as well as in the police, security forces and special task forces, etc. of the USA, as is also the case with the members of criminal organizations such as in the USA, among others, the Ku Klux Klan, the U.S. Mafia, that is to say, La Cosa Nostra, the Hells Angels, and the Aryan Brotherhood. And just as these criminal organizations are predisposed, so are the rulers, the military and secret services, as well as all those from all strata of the population who, as fellow travelers, act without hesitation within the same framework and indulge in inhumane and inhuman behavior, while that part of the righteous population who rejects all unjust machinations of the rulers, as well as security forces, etc., has nothing to say. So if we had openly approached the U.S. government, we would inevitably have come into conflict with the U.S. military and intelligence services as well as with various criminal organizations, especially those that are fundamentally xenophobic and racist in their delusions. This, while other similar organizations as well as the government, military and secret services, would have been out to get hold of our technology, which would inevitably have led to degenerate actions with deadly weapons and even to effective warlike degenerations, which would not have led to great hardship and suffering for us, but to much misery for the population of the USA, as well as death, destruction, and unimaginable devastation throughout the country. Also, great hatred would have been unleashed against us by many xenophobic upper elites in the USA, as well as nationwide anarchy would have arisen and epidemics would have broken out, as calculation forecasts have shown. But also many other very hard, difficult, and malignant factors, as these were warningly mentioned in the calculation forecasts in our directives and were to be followed without question, have prevented us from seeking a direct contact for the Earth or Earth humans and from having a teaching effect on them via the USA, in order to bring Earth humans onto a path which should have led globally to peace. Unfortunately, this attempt was already nipped in the bud by the first of our efforts to contact the U.S. government through your mediation and that of ELI, due to impossible, arrogant and megalomaniac demands, as a result of which we refrained from further efforts and will never make another attempt. For Earth and earthly humanity, the opportunity to achieve global peace has been blocked by the pathological self-importance of the U.S. government. The pathological megalomania of those responsible for the rejection of our attempt at contact in the USA clearly proved to us that it will not be possible for us Plejaran to enter into indirect contact in any other form with those responsible for the state of the USA or with any Earth governments or Earth humans at all.
Note Billy, megalomania is to be understood as a pathological delusion of grandeur, which corresponds to a cognitive distortion through overvaluation of one's own intellect, one's own reason and one's own abilities and competences, but which is also connected with a pathological overestimation of oneself, self-importance, arrogance and with pride as a result of a delusion of self-exaltation, in which the human being believes himself to be great, powerful, master of all things and an important personality, and in this gigantomania delusion displays a maliciously dominating striving as well as bossiness, and putting himself above all human beings, and despising his fellow human beings, whereby these are supposed to be surpassed by the allegedly great and high achievements of the megalomaniac.
This means, however, that through the shameful failure of the USA, with regard to our attempted establishment of contact through you, their old-fashioned, world-dominion-addicted and self-important condition will be carried on just as the enmity of many Earth humans and their wars among each other will continue in the old style, and also in the future bitterly evil events and very much disaster will befall the world and Earth humans. And now it is still to be explained why we asked you only to mediate with the United States of America, but not with the USSR. For the reason was solely that at that time, only the USA was big and strong enough to become active on a global scale in accordance with our intended task. while the Soviet Union had largely collapsed and was incapable of fulfilling such a task as we had intended. On the contrary, the USA, in contrast to the USSR, had all the necessary means and all the other necessary possibilities at that time to act according to our instructions and to include the USSR in the whole process in a completely peaceful way. If the megalomania, the imperiousness as well as the self-importance of the state leaders of the USA had not opposed our peaceful, well-considered and selfless attempt with vituperative, nonsensical, and arrogant as well as senseless and unreasonable demands. And these demands were so marked by self-importance, megalomania, lust for power and domination that we had to recognize that these unvalues were far too deeply rooted and the whole negative and malignant degenerations to it were so marked that they could not have been changed for the better, the good, and the correct, even by our teachings in useful time.
After the end of the World War in 1945, the bankruptcy of the USSR system quietly and unnoticeably began to take place for the whole world, with which the subterranean dissolution of Soviet nostalgia also began, which then ultimately also actually led to the change and dissolution of the Soviet Union. Although in communist circles the mourning with regard to the communism system has not disappeared to this day. Consequently, even today, communism supporters working in the Kremlin still mourn the lost USSR great power status.
I am aware of that, but now, Edward, I still have a few things to bring up in private, after which I must go my way again.